Good morning, everyone, and welcome to day 2 of the Green Ribbon Science Panel. Thank you all for being here. We have feedback again. Hold on one moment. I hear myself 3 times. Can people hear me? I still hear me. It's okay. We'll make this quick. Welcome to day 2. Thank you for being here. We're really excited for today's presentations. I am Alex Troller, Senior Environmental Scientist with DTSC. And I am going to be just running through our housekeeping one last time as a reminder. So you all have microphones on your tables. The red light indicates that you're muted. Please remember to mute yourself after speaking so that we don't have feedback. And then emergency exits, please take a look and identify 2 routes out of this room. Hopefully those routes didn't change from yesterday, but there are multiple ways to get out of this room. So take a moment. Our relocation site, if we need to leave the building, is across the street at Cesar Chavez Park. And if we have to relocate, please bring your valuables with you. Bathrooms outside, women's is to the right, men's is to the left, and there's also a water fountain outside as well. Most important piece of business, today's meeting is subject to the Bagley-Keene Open Meeting Act, which preserves the public transparency with the panel's discussions and decisions. So we ask that to comply with this act, please refrain from speaking about our agenda topics today outside of this meeting. With that, I am going to pass it over to get started. So I'm going to pass it over to our co-chairs, Molly Jacobs and Mike Carangelo. Thank you.
Do you want to? Okay. Yeah. Good morning, everyone. I'll let Molly start us off.
Okay. We have to have like multiple voices here.
Exactly.
Good morning. Hope everybody had a restful sleep and is ready for a bit of a balmy day. I have to say I'm a bit nervous for it. I live in Vermont and we had snow just 2 weeks ago. So I don't know how to go from, 30-degree weather to 100-degree weather, but it's going to be a challenge. We've got a half-day meeting planned. So it is, again, a hybrid meeting. I think we're going to have a couple of our panelists attending on Zoom. We will end the meeting by 12:15. And we have 2 sessions today. So the first, we're going to hear from Kim Hazard and Alicia Lim about the Pearl project, so the Promoting Transparency and Emerging Alternatives Recognition List. This was referenced several times yesterday, so we are looking forward to dig in with this topic with the staff and try to think about this issue of transparency and disclosure and support for alternatives as they're emerging around this process. And then again, unusual for a topic for this panel, but was of keen interest to the staff to just have an opportunity to hear more from the panelists themselves about the research that each of us might be working on, about observations and reflections about the work of colleagues and others that we might be experiencing to help illuminate, inform, direct, raise questions, opportunities, challenges about how some of this might interface more with the program going forward. So interested to see how that'll unfold. But and as I mentioned yesterday, just very interested to hear about the work of all of you myself. So I think that's it. So we're going to start with the public comment, and then we'll move on to our actual official sessions. So I'm going to pass it back to Alex for our
public comment.
The public comment portion of the meeting.
We're now opening up for public comment. Again, reminder, there are 2 ways to comment, we have comment cards located at the entrance to the room for anyone who would like to comment in person, but we also have, we also can submit comments online at safer consumer products at dtsc.ca.gov. We have that email address as well, so we will be monitoring the email address. Again, that's safer consumer products at dtsc.ca.gov. And we're going to give it 1 to 2 minutes for public comment, so everyone enjoy the silence. Maybe some self-reflection. I am not seeing any public comments, so I am going to pass it off to, I'm just going to pass it off to our first presentation. Or do we need to do roll call again? No.
Why don't we go ahead and do a roll call, because we have switched a little bit, just so we know who's in the room and who's online if we could. And we'll let Suzanne start.
Suzanne Brander from Oregon State University.
Mateo Couch.
Emma Lavoie.
Ellie Moran.
Art Fong.
Mike Carangello.
Molly Jacobs.
Heather McKenney.
Good morning, Tim Malloy. Ann Blake.
Ellen Holder.
And online,
Elaine Cohen-Hubble.
okay, so we've only got Elaine online. Thank you. Okay, great, thank you. And we can jump right into the first presentation.
I'm going to pass it off now to Kim Hazard and Alicia Lim, who are going to be discussing and presenting on the Pearl.
Good morning. Hi, everyone. Welcome. I am Kim Hazard. I'm joined by Alicia Lim today. We're very excited to introduce, today's big topic that had a little bit of introduction yesterday. We are introducing the Pearl. So the Pearl is a new program that recognizes chemical manufacturers that voluntarily provide hazard and performance data, particularly for alternatives to candidate chemicals. We hope that today's conversation will be building on previous conversations we've had about defining safer, increasing demand for safer products and supporting innovation. And really the original idea for the Pearl came out of GRSP, with a lot of credit going to Ann Blake. So we're really happy to be able to bring this back before she leaves the panel. So we are hoping to pilot this program this calendar year. We've been working on it for a long time, a few years at this point, which goes by fast in government. But we are excited to open it up for your feedback. There have been several iterations and really looking for solidifying the vision as we prepare to pilot. So for context, more than once, SCP has been made aware of potential feasible alternatives for use in our priority products. But these folks that make up these alternatives simply just can't get their foot in the door, can't get a word in with our responsible entities or REs. Additionally, through our experience with the 6PPD project recently, we continue to be plagued with data gaps for both hazard of potential alternatives as well as performance. We might see potential safer alternatives, but with a lack of performance data, they may get screened out a little early. So the Pearl was really envisioned to address these questions of how do we increase awareness well ahead of the AA process of alternatives. At a bare minimum, we are required to open public comment period at the final AA release stage. But we are, really seeking a more built-in process for getting people involved earlier in the process. How do we help manufacturers who have alternatives enter the market successfully? And how do we address these issues around chemical transparency that we continue to run into in our work? So the overall goal of the Pearl is to enhance transparency by recognizing manufacturers that provide public data that is sufficient hazard and performance data to facilitate an informed evaluation of alternatives as part of our AA process. So that looks like rewarding manufacturers for transparency with recognition from DTSC. In addition, any alternatives that appear on our website ahead of the AA have to be evaluated as part of that process. We want to increase market awareness by providing a platform to really spotlight these potential alternatives. And we hope that the Pearl supports our AA process by providing that sufficient data on alternatives to candidate chemicals for use in listed or potential priority products. And really want to encourage engagement and partnerships by identifying market-ready alternatives well before the AA process begins. So who is our intended audience here? We are targeting chemical manufacturers that have alternatives to candidate chemicals in specific consumer products. So that could be listed or proposed priority products, or alternatives that serve a specific functional use. So as we were talking about yesterday, there's a lot of PFAS alternatives, but it's not a one size fits all. And so we really want this to be targeted for a good fit for our priority products, and maybe a call for certain functional uses that we continue to run into problems with. And so as you can see, we are kind of taking one step up from where our regulated community is. So we are really focused on engagement with the suppliers or producers that would be engaging with our responsible entities. So just for a bit more context, per our regs, an alternative can mean a number of things that an RE should be looking at. The Pearl is really designed to focus primarily on chemistries, replacement chemistries. But we are also open to considering, potential technology or process changes or replacement materials as part of the Pearl. But the current vision really is kind of focusing in on that drop-in replacement piece. So how does it work? We will identify our priority alternative categories. So again, that could be driven by upcoming priority product listings that we have, or certain critical functional uses that we identify. Then we'll send out a call for submittals, information submittals. And hopefully with good engagement, we will receive information through CalSafer. And so the Pearlies will submit hazard and performance data. We will go into the specifics of that. They can protect the chemical ID, so they can submit under a trade name. And then internally, SCP will evaluate that data for both completeness and quality. And then once we've sort of evaluated that, then there's the recognition piece. So the name of the alternative as well as the submitter is listed on the Pearl, which is again a platform on CalSafer as well as a web page on our website. And all of the submitted data then becomes public. And so if the timing is right, then we'll have this sort of pool of alternatives that is provided to an RE at the outset of an AA. And now I'll hand it over to Alicia.
Thanks, Kim. I am the right height for this microphone. So I'll kind of go over some of what Kim already said. So now that we know how the Pearl process itself looks like, how does the Pearl itself fit into our overall process at SCP? So again, as Kim mentioned earlier, our focus for the Pearl is on chemical manufacturers who have potential alternatives to chemicals of concern and priority products. When a product chemical combination is publicly identified, SCP can then announce calls for information submittals to the Pearl for those specific product chemical combinations of interest, with targeted outreach to chemical manufacturers leading up all the way to the finalization of rulemaking. And you can see in the bracketed area, that's the ideal window of opportunity for the Pearl. So before the priority product rulemaking is completed. And again, as Kim mentioned earlier, these chemical manufacturers are generally one step up from where the responsibility lies for REs, who are generally product manufacturers. And as we get submissions to the Pearl, we can then build this pool of alternatives that we can list on our website as the AA process begins. The REs then have to evaluate any alternatives listed on the Pearl. And since they are submitting since the chemical manufacturers are submitting hazard and performance data, the product manufacturers can then use that data to do their AAs. And by targeting further up the supply chain, we're hoping this will have a cascading effect that ultimately leads to better transparency and better alternatives. And we'd also like to kind of show our process of how the Pearl has developed over these years. So on the left are the current program elements that we intend to keep. And on the right are things that we've thought about and have decided won't work for us. So starting with the elements that we are keeping, we're focusing very heavily on data transparency. So that's one of our key goals. And it's also our understanding that it can be very difficult for emerging alternatives to break into the market. So we're hoping that the Pearl will help them by connecting them to REs. It's one of SCP's carrots, and we have a set of required hazard endpoints that haven't changed throughout the many iterations of the Pearl. So those have stayed the same. We also want alignment with green screen. And also we will provide recognition to Pearlies or those chemical manufacturers on our SCP website. And as for elements that are no longer part of the current iteration of the Pearl, we want to avoid using Pearl to say that an alternative is safe or safer, to keep the focus of alternatives analysis in SCP's AA process. So the goal, again, is transparency and information availability. We've also moved away from product level recognition. Instead, we're focusing on a specific alternative or chemical. And as as mentioned earlier, we're not requiring chemical identification, so they can submit under a trade name. And we also thought about an automatic listing process based on just data completeness, but then we decided that data quality criteria is necessary as well. And also originally we were thinking about recognition with some sort of promotional package, such as a label, a seal, or a logo, but we're worried that it would be misused. So that's also no longer part of our program as it is currently. And so going over our minimum data requirements, there are two main ones, hazard endpoint data and performance data. And again, we strongly recommend chemical identification information, but not requiring it. So trade names are okay. And looking at the minimum hazard endpoint data, we know that there probably will be data gaps, but we are hoping they can fill this with modeled or estimated data, even though experimental data is preferred. So any data gaps will not be allowed. And then data from third-party evaluations and certifications of chemicals may also fulfill the hazard endpoint data requirement, such as from green screen or the safer chemicals ingredient list. However, we want this evaluation to focus on the chemical, not the product level. And we also want clear sources or like data for the actual basis for the hazard scoring. So they can't just submit like a number or color of a scoring of how safe a chemical is. We want to see the data. And regarding this last point, we discussed how SCP can recognize other labeling or certification programs in our last GRSP meeting. And it'd be great if the Pearl could complement and align with these other programs. So we welcome any feedback you might have about the pros and cons of incorporating other programs for chemical alternatives into our Pearl process, and also which specific programs you may or may not recommend. And as our performance data, we have no minimum requirements here, because the data would be product specific, and we're hoping that the manufacturers want to promote their alternatives to the REs and would provide sufficient and good performance data there. And as for our minimum hazard endpoint data, these are the endpoints we're currently requiring, and these are based on the Washington Department of Ecology's criteria for safer. So we're not making any determinations of safer or safe, but we do want data on these endpoints, and these endpoints haven't changed since the beginning of the project. And yeah, thanks for listening. And just to reiterate, our key goals for the Pearl are to incentivize data transparency, increase market awareness of emerging alternatives early on in the SCP process, and also to support our existing AA process. And we're currently finalizing our program development. So it's a really good point to incorporate any ideas you might have or feedback. And we're excited to carry out one of SCP's carrots to our many sticks. And I'd also like to thank the other two members of our Pearl Core 4 team, so Alex and Kyle, who have been running GRSP and doing a great job, and who are also here. So with that said, we'd like to move into questions, and back to Kim.
So, thank you. We can open it up for clarifying questions first before moving into charge questions.
Yeah, I think I saw Helen's go up first. We'll start with Helen.
You mentioned in the about, I just want to clarify, do responsible entities have to consider anything that's on the list as part of whatever AA or decision making that they're doing? Is that going to become a formal requirement?
Yeah, so that is in our regs, that information on alternatives that's available on our website has to be considered. We have sort of an informal process for that right now. We sort of include that information in a priority product profile that usually gets transferred somewhere on a landing page for a priority product. But yes, if we can tie the alternative to the priority product, which is part of the information submittal, they select sort of, they provide a description of the functional use as well as what products it could be used in. So when we match a priority product to an alternative, if it's on there prior to kind of the start date of, I don't know if there's a specific date requirement, but it's supposed to be prior to the start of the preliminary AA, then yes, those alternatives have to be evaluated by REs.
Cool. I believe Mateo is next.
Thank you. I had a question whether there be any kind of information about the state of commercialization of the alternative. So if it's like, available at mass production scale, industrial production scale, or more of a new.
Yeah, that's a really good point. I don't know that we require that information. I think we do have a placeholder in the information submittal packet for information about that, but any ideas on standardizing, like how to ask that question about market readiness and scalability would be welcome.
Yeah, I think there is like some rating scheme for, yeah. So others might comment on that.
Okay, Heather.
I was just curious if you could speak a little bit more to how CBI, it sounds like, is handled in the program. I see that chemical identification in the secret sauce is out, but also if the information needs to be assessed, or the hazard information needs to be assessed at the chemical level,
Mhm.
is the program dealing in CBI and not sharing that on their website? So kind of how does that work in practicality?
Yeah, the current setup was designed with all transparency all the time in mind. So we originally said, you have to identify the chemical. Then we kind of walked back on that and thought, who's gonna want to share that? Generally, we've kind of run into that issue. So we are sort of trying to figure out how to strike the balance between being able to evaluate the quality of the data that's submitted while still protecting, allowing for, submission under a trade name. So I think the way it's set up currently is that it could just be a trade name, and we won't be handling CBI. But we do have processes in place to handle CBI, but I think we wanted to try to avoid that if possible.
You're nodding, Heather, so that answered it.
If I have a follow-up.
Okay, Tim,
Thanks. This is really exciting. Two questions, kind of clarifying. I may have missed it, but like in your hazard things that you look at, if the underlying chemical of concern had a hazard endpoint that wasn't in your minimum requirements, would that also be required to be in the package?
Yeah, so we currently have just like kind of one single Pearl. We have considered like a tiered Pearl where it gets a little bit more specific about certain endpoints and when they're required. Potential for a future iteration of this, but these are just the minimum requirements. And we would encourage, if there's a known hazard endpoint aside from this list, that they submit that optionally.
Okay. And then the other question is, what happens if somebody submits something to Pearl and gets rejected? Does it go on a, bad Pearl list somewhere, or is it not required to be reviewed in the AA?
Right. So we've shifted away from thinking of it as like an application where there's like approval or not approval. It's more just like an information submittal, and either we put it on our website or not. I think it's a voluntary program. Along with other parts of SCP, we want compliance more than anything. So this is a reward, not shaming system. So the idea is that an entity could submit information until they get it right. We could coach them up on getting the right information there so that they can appear on the Pearl. But that's it. It's just you're either appearing on the Pearl or not.
okay, Suzanne.
Just looking at this list, and I had a clarifying question based on a lot of groups using PBMT criteria, so persistent, bioaccumulative, mobile, toxic, as for hazard evaluation. Is the mobility of the chemical not considered here?
No. So in the, I think, appendix of the background document, we have sort of our proposed table of sort of what the data that we're looking for looks like for these required endpoints. So some of that might kind of be an indicator for some of that, but currently, no. If it's not in bold here, then it's not one of our required endpoints.
Okay, Mateo, you have another.
Yeah, sorry, another question. So it sounds like this will be rolled out with calls for alternatives for specific chemical combinations, right? So have you considered kind of doing a pilot with one specific?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, so the goal is to pilot this year. We've already been in conversation with some folks through the 6PPD process. And so while it's not going to be kind of in that pool of alternatives ahead of the AA process, we still want to kind of test out this process, see how feasible it is for people to submit this information, use CalSafer, get the website set up sort of using the who we've already interacted with through 6PPD alternatives primarily.
Okay, and Julie,
Yes, thank you. I think maybe I missed it. Will DTSC or SCP staff be doing any type of audit of the data that is provided?
Yeah, so we are looking at completeness and quality. So we are still developing sort of what that QA process looks like. It's sort of the last piece of the puzzle here. You know, 6 months ago, we were just like, oh, if they submit the data and it's 100% complete, they get put on the website. But we're trying to think about how do we ensure that, you know, that quality data is really what we're looking for. So all of that is open for discussion today.
Thank you.
perfect. Okay, so thank you everyone for the clarifying questions. Thank you for an excellent presentation. You know, people having clarifying questions to ask means they're really interested, and you opened a lot of doors. So hopefully this will be a good discussion coming up. Because we are going to move now into the open discussion portion. Just yet again, a reminder, and you were all just doing it, so I don't think you need to be reminded, but we'll use the tent cards for when you wanted to speak. We have eyes on both Elaine and Julie, and I will be notified if they raise their hands. I think that's been working pretty well. And so we have 3 charge questions here for you to consider that they would like some information back on our thoughts. So what are the main barriers to generating quality hazard and performance data for emerging alternatives? What are the main barriers to chemical ingredient and hazard transparency? And I shouldn't sit back trying to read instead of sitting by the microphone. Which of these barriers is SCP best positioned to address, and how can we optimize the PRL to do so? Is DTSC SCP recognition a sufficient carrot to gather and share data critical to an informed AA? If not, what other non-regulatory activities can we couple with PRL recognition to incentivize transparency? And to what extent should the PRL attempt to recognize safer alternatives or screen out alternatives that appear not safe? We are going to do this like we talked yesterday. We don't have to answer these 1, 2, 3. It can be open discussion. Try and let me know which ones you're answering if possible. And I only ask that, and I can try and figure it out on my own too. But I want to make sure that we touch on all the questions because we can't get way deep in one and then leave the other 2. So if possible,
I'm
do
happy
that.
to frame up some of these questions as well if you're confused about anything. But I do want to point out that sort of in this first question, we're thinking about both generating the data and then sharing the data. I think that we're really interested in sort of what are the barriers for both of those, and where does the PRL fit into those barriers. And I think the conversation in question 2 can really call back to incentivizing, innovation as well. And given that we currently don't have a definition of safer or not safe for the program, we are working on that, and someone could provide an update on that recommendation, but we don't have a formal definition for that quite yet. So just wanted to flag that.
Cool, thank you. Okay, so we will get started, and I've got Helen first.
Actually, I have a residual clarifying question before I tackle the charge questions. Could you address or just help me understand a little more about the targeting of who you would like to be engaging with? You said chemical manufacturers. Is there a kind of small, medium, large? Is there something that you're thinking there? And how are you thinking of that outreach? And sort of the flip side of that, how would an innovative chemical synthesis company or materials company know about this and get into this program? So can you talk a little bit about that, like outreach and onboarding?
Yeah, so we have, emerging alternatives as part of the program name. And so it doesn't have to necessarily be novel entities, although that is a target audience for sure. But we had a conversation with BASF last week or 2 weeks ago, and, they sort of had a chemical that seemed to sort of fit this program as well. And so it could be large companies, small companies. I think there's going to be greater barriers in terms of the cost of generating the data for smaller entities potentially. And so we really want to consider that in this discussion on barriers. But company size is open to all. How are we going to reach them? It's kind of the perpetual question of how do we identify alternatives in the first place too? And just reaching out to networks, trade associations. A lot of the information sort of comes to us through the conferences that we go to saying, hey, I have an alternative. No one's listening to me. That's happened more than once. So that's kind of what the game plan is. And also we're hoping to sort of tag along with our existing workshop structure. So when a priority product is going into a workshop, making sure that we have a slide at the end about calls for information submittal for the Pearl. So say, like we're doing a workshop on PFAS and artificial turf, say, hey, do you have alternatives to PFAS and artificial turf? Get in touch with us.
Thank you. Matea or Molly, you were up next.
It's a comment, but also a question maybe posed to some of our panelists. And so I'm just interested in I think green screen is a fantastic hazard assessment tool, but I'm just wondering why the focus just on that methodology. And I'm just trying to think of something. I'm just trying to think of how to make sure this is the methodologies that are established are perennial over time. And there's a part of me that's concerned about NGOs and what happens to them in the long term and sustainability of funding, what happens to ensure methodologies are updated. And so given that it's built on GHS, GHS is used in SDSs, GHS. What green screen adds is a nice color coding to existing hazard categories, but the hazard categories themselves are very defined and used globally. And so and the GHS is also used by Cradle to Cradle and Safer Choice. So why not just use GHS and their hazard categories, and it makes it independent? Granted, color coding, flashlight, red, yellow, green, fantastic, very high, very low. But I want to ask our panelists who are really hazard assessment experts, what would we miss by just using GHS, if you don't mind?
I can jump in just to answer that specific question, Molly. Is it possible to put the list back up on the screen? Because as written, I don't believe we'll miss any of the required endpoints, but we'll miss some of those additional, so endocrine disruption. Persistence and bioaccumulation are not defined under GHS, but CLP has criteria. And there's
persistence now though, as the PM, or maybe just under the EU regime.
Like the PBT assessment and PMT assessment. It tells there is criteria you could use to classify something as persistent, but it's not standalone. So it's embedded within the criteria of PBT and PMT. And that's also where the mobility would be found, is under those new CLP criteria. So what you're saying, Molly, I think it would have to be GHS plus CLP if we were to use some of those established global and/or European standards.
Yeah, and just to Molly's point, we're not married to green screen in particular. It's just one of the programs that we thought there would be alignment with. So if someone is going through a green screen, just shoot us that data as well while you're at it and get on the Pearl. But I think maybe having the criteria based in GHS makes sense. Yeah.
Just a couple more things. One is on Mateo's question about, will these entities report, this current scale? Helen mentioned technical readiness levels. These are developed out of the aerospace world, used very broadly and readily in the innovation space. So kind of describes whether something is at basic research stage or demonstration stage or scalability. So incorporating those, but just also, I think it would be of value to have some kind of basic guideline of some performance indicators to report on. Getting at that question of scale, you could ask the question, what's the current annual production capacity, or what's the projected production capacity in the next 5 years, right? Current versus future might look something different. But also really key, I think, are whether or not there are industry certifications obtained, because that's going to slow down significantly the adoption of any alternative if it hasn't been certified for certain kind of industry standards or requirements. And so just thinking through, I think some of those maybe high level criteria or expectations that you want to see could be of value, because that's what the product manufacturers are going to be looking for. And also, just a question also about knowing that that question about quality, and looking over the data when you don't know it's this issue. I just worked on this project with Saskia Van Bergen, and we were trying to look for what alternatives have been adopted for phthalates and bisphenols and PFAS, and you can't find out, right? So it's this forever problem about lack of data transparency, and so the only way often that we can do this is the use of third-party certifications. It's the only way that we have any kind of a surety that, okay, these alternatives have been vetted. It's fine that they haven't disclosed it. It's fine that they're not being transparent about their hazard data, but somebody else has vetted it. And therefore, I can be somewhat confident, that this alternative is moving in the right direction. So I feel like there has to be some sort of something there for this recognition list. It's fine that you don't declare it as safer, but it feels important for DTSC to be some sort of third-party verifier in some way, shape, or form, and not to just list it because we all can't look at the chemical name. We don't, and if nobody else is validating and being able to track the hazard information, anyway, it's very useful to have third-party verifications. And so, yes, pooling those existing ones into this database would be really helpful. And then thinking through how can DTSC be a third-party verifier in some way, shape, or form would be useful to consider.
Okay, Mateo, you're up next.
Okay, I apologize in advance. I have a couple of points, and I'm just overall super excited about this. But on the GHS versus other methodologies, I think the other piece that might be missing, and Heather, keep me honest here, is that GHS, you have categories for hazard, right? But you don't have categories for proven absence of hazard, right? So like you can kind of, I think the element that you would want to add is like their mutagenicity studies have been conducted and they're negative, right? Like, because that's just no GHS category, right? Like you don't know if it's a data gap or safe, right? I think that's a key thing that would need to be included.
And that's why we kind of want this program to peel back the curtain behind the red, yellow, green, right? Like, we don't want just the hazard bands or just the categorization that comes from, no GHS hazard flag for this endpoint, right? Like we want exactly like you're saying, negative studies showing,
And so I think, but there is obviously green screen, cradle to cradle, Chem Forward pulls a bunch of that together. I think there is a lot of things to pick. And then on question one, I actually think, the hazard piece is the easy piece, right? The performance piece is the really tricky piece. So definitely encourage the staff to spend a lot more time there. I'm glad that you're starting with sort of a specific pilot with a fairly narrow product group and application, because you cannot, unlike hazard, you cannot evaluate performance at the chemical level. It's got to be, very specific to a product, and often, not just a theoretical product, but a specific product, right? So chemical manufacturers cannot even evaluate performance on their own. They need a product manufacturer, right, to try it out and see, does it work with the manufacturing processes? If you make a product and test it at the product level, right? Like, how does it perform, right? So that's really the hard piece. And so that kind of brings me back to, also question 2 and some of the points Molly made, right? Like, I saw that there was a consideration of maybe having some kind of product recognition, and you're moved away from that. But I think, like, that makes really having useful performance considered in there difficult. And then also, I think, probably takes away the biggest carrot that you would have, right? Like, because just sort of being listed on the database for a chemical, that might make the alternative assessment a little easier for some responsible entities if they choose to go there, right? Like, that seems like a pretty remote. Yeah.
That was why I was asking if it was required to be considered, because that actually makes that's the carrot. It's not being on the website. Nobody cares. People care about making money on their product. And by requiring the responsible entity to consider an option, that is the actual carrot. And so that's specifically why I'd asked that question. So if it's required, it's a carrot. If it's something on a website, that's just not motivating to most businesses.
Yeah, and that would be a carrot, right, for the product manufacturers. But the bigger carrot, I think, would be, like, if as a manufacturer I could get my product listed as, hey, I'm verified as using a safer alternative, right? Like, and you could actually send that signal to the market, right? That's a much bigger carrot. But it would require verification at the product level.
Okay, so right now I have Art, then Anne, then Kelly, then Heather, is how my list is going at the moment. Heather's been keeping me guessing here, so that is my order at the moment. Art, you're up.
Suzanne.
Just want to actually respond to Molly's comments about chemical hazard assessment. Just to let you know that Lauren Hine, who recently did a CTEC webinar on defining what safer is, and I and several others are working on a paper or study looking into what are the critical elements of a practical, meaningful, and defensible chemical hazard assessment framework. So we're working on that right now. I've got comments about.
Can I ask, how does that differ than what's being currently done in terms of like hazard assessment frameworks?
Well, not just the hazard endpoints, but what else are critical when it comes to having the work product tell you or help you understand if something is potentially hazardous. So it's not just hazard endpoints, but critical elements of a chemical hazard assessment framework. I'll have some comments about the charge questions, but just really want to highlight the fact that, Kim, when you said, you're avoiding or being really careful about using the term safer, I love that. Because again, given the fact that, with the science evolving so fast and the very large data gaps, on many of the chemicals and products that DTSC is interested in, using the term safe is just really hard to defend. So love what you're doing there. And Mateo's point about, and Helen's point about, signal to the market. Yeah, having your name or product listed on a website doesn't mean anything. Even the program as robust as Safer Choice, having the labels on the products, studies have shown that it actually have limited impact on people's buying preferences. But what would be an incentive, and Helen has pointed this out a number of times, it's like, in addition to, let's say, a label or something, and actually that product gets on some kind of government or large institution procurement. I mean, that would, actually work. So I'll stop there and do my comments on the charge questions later. Thank you.
Thank you, Art. Anne?
Thank you. And first off, it's very kind of you to credit me for the idea for this. I honestly don't remember that. So I think whatever it was that spurred you, you have run with it and done a marvelous thing. And actually, what I see more is Kim Hazard coming from Berkeley Center for Green Chemistry and Greener Solutions, which I definitely see the imprint here. So thank you for that, because I know we've been nagging you about partnerships there, and you paid attention. So much appreciated. One quick question to follow up for Art. The Safer Choice not affecting people's purchasing, is there a difference that you see? That's really a B2C. Do you see a difference in the purchasing of the carrots that you and Helen have been talking about? I think have been more business to business type purchasing.
Government purchasing, yeah.
And government purchasing
Yeah,
for Safer.
government
Thank you.
purchases,
That's
yeah.
a helpful clarification. To the charge questions, I think the biggest point, you've started getting used to it through Greener Solutions, but adding the performance piece is a huge step. Because as many of us who've been working on market barriers to safer options know, the two key consistent barriers are investment in incumbent technology, which that's a heavy lift, and also just lack of clarity as to what greener and or safer means across the supply chain. So the fact that you've set this and you've set it at the product and chemical level is a huge addition. And the fact, of course, that these criteria are going to be different. Acknowledging Mateo's point that this is the harder part. It's also the product and chemical combination specific part, the functional use piece. You know this. My one question attached to this is there room for additional product and chemical specific criteria? You've got your minimum criteria, but obviously the performance criteria are going to be different. And you mentioned something about particular hazard endpoints that might be relevant for one particular function. I'm assuming that there's room for that, but yeah.
Certainly. I think our approach was, let's have the most simplified version to pilot as possible. But there certainly have been conversations about the potential for sort of what we've been calling like a tiered pearl, which gets a little complicated when you start mixing metals and pearls, but like a gold pearl, silver pearl. But in terms of, like if there are sort of these specific things that need to be matched, like is there a bar to meet just for the basic pearl versus like the platinum pearl, whatever?
Yeah, there's actually we can talk about this offline as well, but when we started creating the green business program, we had something similar. There were folks that we wanted to reach. Actually, we started with nail salons when there were no safer alternatives, and so we did minimum criteria that said you were a safer salon, and then that sort of, I hope, spurred some work on safer products. Thank you. So I gather you're already thinking about this. To question 3 about whether you should screen out alternatives that appear safe or not safe, I think that's tied a little bit to your data quality question, but I would say let the data speak. At the end of Greener Solutions, you always put up that total summary of all the alternatives you've looked at and the gaps. I think that's the most powerful way of presenting the data. And then let's see, question 2. The carrot and stick, other non-regulatory activities. I guess I would encourage you, and I think you're already doing this, but encourage you to work with other partners already working on alternatives and trying to promote alternatives in whatever category you're approaching at this time. So, and yeah, I would just echo the excitement of my fellow panelists. This is a really cool step.
Do you have any specific recommendations on your last point?
On people to work with? Depends on the category, but we can talk about it. Yeah.
Thank you. And so I have Kelly, Heather, Suzanne, Mateo, and Tim lined up next. So Kelly.
Yeah, thank you. I'm gonna be a little bit of a curmudgeon here. I'm actually really excited about the goals of this and the vision that you shared, and I'm excited that the staff team has spent a lot of time on this. I'm feeling a little nervous that you've made a lot of decisions. You're presenting them as decisions, and we're kind of challenging those. So I'm hoping that you'll recognize that's not out of disrespect, but out of support for you guys. So I just want to say that ahead of time. My experience with number 3, recognizing safer alternatives, has been almost uniformly negative, with the exception of the programs that Emma's been involved with. A lot of them wind up recognizing things that are super marginal. So people spend their time putting stuff in, and DTSC a long time ago actually had a certification program for hazardous waste treatment systems that was just the golden goose for things that were really terrible, trying to get certified by the state so that it would create a market. So I just really want to caution that you guys should stay as far away as possible from that kind of stuff, and letting the data speak is a really important role. I'm also really concerned about the criteria that you listed. So for example, if you go back to the criteria slide, I don't know if you can, maybe you can't. I can get you to everyone to remember that. If you take 6 PPD and you put it in this list, 6 PPD itself is going to do great because it's the thing that degrades into the thing that is super toxic and a bunch of other chemicals. So yeah, it's not persistent. It doesn't much bioaccumulate. It's not all that toxic compared to other things. It's the degradate that's the problem. So, and another example of this that I want to highlights another problem with aquatic toxicity. When the pyrethroids first came in the market, people said, oh, they're a safer alternative because they're less toxic to people. Well, turns out they are actually kind of some issues with people. But next to 6-PPD quinone, bifenthrin is probably the most aquatically toxic chemical known, maybe dioxins. But Suzanne's done some incredibly brilliant work in this area. But it would not show up as being any different than any other chemical in this process because the GHS aquatic toxicity groups everything that's toxic, acutely or chronically toxic, under 1 milligram per liter, which is a useless number. So the numbers that really start differentiating chemicals around their aquatic toxicity are in the microgram to nanogram per liter concentration, and that's the concentration ranges in which you find chemicals in the environment. I know I spent a lot of time with folks on green screen and with Emma and others to encourage there to be differentiating tiers in this area. So I got to say, I was actually heartbroken to see this single thing here. When you talk to aquatic toxicologists, a single data point on aquatic toxicology, you don't even know where the dartboard is when you're throwing the dart. It's that bad. So I really want to encourage some rethinking about all of that and endpoint, particularly with the tires example where we're looking at aquatic toxicity. So huge amounts of both human and aquatic exposure. So to that end, one way of addressing that would be to look at each product and product specific elements. So I'm recognizing the tension between the cost of trying to come up with some of this information, and I'm very open to some of that predictive toxicology methods and other things that you were talking about as ways to address that. But I think this framework would almost guarantee that there would be poor information and bad decisions made. So that's why I'm so concerned about it. I'll join the chorus that mobility is a really important criterion. And I'm also concerned about the limitation of this to drop-in replacement chemicals, because one of the unique elements of this program is that it's broader than that. A way of addressing that is, of course, through the accompanying framework documents around the AA. So the idea of including all known alternatives, even if they're not all in the Pearl, including and that would include both chemical and non-chemical or other kinds of alternatives So just having some place, this is just a piece of the overall framework, so it doesn't necessarily need to be addressed here. And then one last thing that happened with the pyrethroids is that people were aware of the extreme toxicity and persistence actually of bifenthrin in particular as an example to certain aquatic organisms, but did not provide that data because they got to pick the organism that they submitted. So the pyrethroids are not very toxic to a lot of things like fathead minnows, and it's sort of other kinds of organisms. So it's really, Cereodaphnia dubia is not that sensitive. So that having at least some mechanism to think about what people disclose, and maybe it's even just at least attempting to require them to disclose whatever information they have or a certification or something, that's pretty weak. But I'm really concerned that people tend to send stuff to a lab and then they only finalize the data they like. And that is super, super common in the chemicals policy world. I really hate it. So thank you again. I'm really supportive of the concept here and where you're trying to go with this. I'm just really, really nervous about it.
Okay, thank you, Kelly. So we've got a lot of people queued up now. Now I have Heather is going to be up next, then I've got Suzanne, then I have Mateo, then I have Tim, then I have Elaine, then I have Emma, then I have Helen. And I'm probably out of order because you're putting these cards up faster than I can turn my head. So that's the order we're going with. So Heather, you're up.
Great, thank you. So one of the things that I think Molly brought up first was this concept of the third-party verification. And I think that's really important, not only at the hazard level, but at the disclosure and composition level, that there needs to be some review or at least criteria definition for what's considered a chemical ingredient. Is that just the intentionally added ingredient? Is there a definition for non-intentionally added substances, impurities, environmental transformation products? I think without having those criteria and standards for a third party, whether it be DTSC or a toxicology firm to look at that, is going to be really critical, or else you run the risk of it being a partial Pearl listing that is purposefully or not purposefully, maybe the supplier does not know, shading their own formula. So I think that that's really important. There's also been a lot of talk about letting the data speak. So this is actually a clarifying question, whether or not the data that DTSC receives through the Pearl program will then be directly communicated to all REs, or is the process that the SCP will receive the data for the endpoints and the performance, review it, and then list it and say, the REs then need to go to those suppliers and get the data themselves, or is there a mechanism to pull the data and directly get it to folks who are completing the AAs?
Yeah, so the idea is that the data is available at that point once it's listed on the website for anyone, for any of the REs or anyone else to access immediately. Yeah.
Okay, great. And then with that, I think Mateo's points about GHS, there are mechanisms that have been developed in certain programs to deal with some of that gray area between the category 2 carcinogen and not classified, right? We can have some data that suggests carcinogenicity that still lands that chemical under not classified under the GHS framework. So looking at those paradigms of equivocal, likely low might be helpful if there were to be specific criteria listed for what would be appropriate for listing on the Pearl. The other thing to think about here is if we are publishing data, there is value in a weight of evidence approach as well, in that if we're just publishing one negative mutagenicity data and saying, well, they fit the criteria, we just needed something, there's again a risk of a potential regrettable substitution. Endocrine, I know, wasn't in the required, but is one estrogen binding assay going to be sufficient to be considered safer? Those are the types of questions that I think the group should think about. Yeah, I think my last point would be that there are programs that are already validating alternatives to a safer standard, which I know is not in scope for Pearl, but there is a third-party verification step that's included, which might be the easiest first step into the program, is looking at which of those programs, maybe it's green screen gold for certain applications. I know that the criteria might vary from program to program, and is it textiles, is it food application? Those criteria change, but taking a look and mapping that to what would be considered acceptable under Pearl, under the GHS or CLP criteria that are defined, and starting there and listing what's already been verified by third parties while the program thinks about whether or not they could fill that role of the third party verifier themselves. Thanks.
Okay, Suzanne, you're up.
Yeah, on the first point about assessing hazard, I kind of wanted to piggyback on some of the points that Kelly had made. And I will say, as someone who has studied endocrine disruptors for a number of years, seeing endocrine disruption under other is a little bit discomforting. I know it's really complex. It's difficult to address. You have all of the issues with needing longer term studies or data from chronic studies, and the issue of non-monotonic or non-linear responses. But all that being said, the report out last year, the PlasChem report that came out that, said there were 16,000 plus chemicals used across the life cycle of plastics. Over 1,000 of those are suspected to be endocrine disruptors. And so it seems that if we are trying to build this, what is a great program and a great potential move towards better transparency, it seems that we should at least try to evaluate endocrine disruptors as best possible, even though there are huge data gaps. Because, like, for example, what Kelly mentioned about bifenthrin, we saw in the lab, as people have seen with many EDCs, that it induced an estrogen response equal to birth control ethinyl estradiol at 1 nanogram per liter. But if you tested it at 100, it didn't. And so really thinking about those long-term low-level exposures, even though it's really challenging, I think is important, or at least if we don't, clearly acknowledging that information was not considered. So that, and anyway, don't want to be a negative ninny here, but also that jumped out at me as something important to think about. And then for the question about if the recognition is enough of a carrot. And I agree that, being featured on a website, they're gonna but if, and this is, more effort, but maybe occasional features on social media or some kind of promotion that is not necessarily hugely costly, but gets more visibility might be a way to go. Thanks.
Thank you, Mateo.
Thank you. I just wanted to circle back to question 2 about the carrot. I do second, Art and Helen's point about government procurement being a very big and very direct carrot, right? Like, you can really show, okay, so if you get on here, then this can drive this amount of business to you. But I did want to challenge kind of the idea that customers don't care at all. Because I do think there's data that shows that general sustainability messaging can improve purchase decisions for, certain groups of customers. But then I'd also be curious to hear, actually from you, Mike. I think if you get to specific product categories and specific product chemical combinations, I do think there's a lot of attention from customers, right? I still see a lot of BPA-free marketing on water bottles, right? I see PFAS free on frying pans, right? Like, and I think, when you look at personal care products, right? Like, you see a lot of that type of marketing, and that's driven by the manufacturers themselves. I think they put that on there because they do have market research showing that it drives purchase decisions. And if there were a layer of government kind of verification that, well, not only is it free of this bad thing that you know about, we actually reviewed it and we think this is like a preferable solution, that could be powerful.
Thank you. Tim, you're next. Then I have Elaine, then Emma, then Helen at the moment.
Thanks. I share a lot of the concerns about the list. Like the endocrine disruption jumped right out at me, some of the things that Kelly said and others. And I asked that question about the hazard trait that underline the chemical of concern, because to me, it seemed like that's the whole ballgame. So like, why would we not ask people who are proposing something as an alternative to speak to the actual trait that we're trying to avoid? But I think others are better situated, as it's obvious from the comments, to address that than me. The thing I wanted to talk about was, like, I took a step back and I was trying to figure out, okay, like, why? I mean, I love the idea, but then like Kelly, I'm like, I took a step back and I'm like, okay, so as compared to what? Like, what is this doing for you? Or as Kelly would say, I created a conceptual model, okay? And my thought was, so what's the underlying goal? Because in my mind, you've got Pearl and you've got the manufacturer of the chemical product combination doing an AA, and then you've got DTSC reviewing that AA. One of the things that kind of raised a little bit of question for me was, okay, so now with Pearl set up the way it is, it looks like DTSC could potentially be reviewing data on this alternative twice, like once for Pearl with this limited set of endpoints, and then if the alternative makes it through the AA and there's the full set of data on all the relevant factors, now you're going to review it again. So one possibility would be, okay, so this like gets some stuff done early, we clean, but if there's not like alignment between those two, and it doesn't seem clear to me that there is necessarily, depending on what the manufacturer decides to do in their AA as their hazard assessment, then it seems like that there's marginal value to the early review part of this. So I wouldn't like do Pearl just because of that. It seems like the real driver is kind of a brokering or channeling function. So you're trying to get the AA manufacturer to think about these alternatives that might be out there. And you're also trying to get the alternative manufacturer to get involved in the AA. And that's what you're trying to do. You're trying to like do this, which I think is a terrific idea. I'm not, but here's the issue the problem I'm having seen that is one way to set this up would be to say, well, one of the things we're going to be doing is we're going to be like looking at these potential alternatives, and then we're going to make a call. This is what I originally thought Pearl was doing. We'll make sort of a call about whether this really, I mean, you're going to require people to review this. So maybe you do a screening function. You say, here's something you ought to review. Here's something don't waste your time or our time reviewing it. And Pearl could serve that kind of like a screening function, right? And that takes you to question 3, safe or not safe. And if you wanted to do that, it seems to me another approach would be, rather than to try to say safer or say, it's too early to say safer, because safer implies a comparison. That means you would be looking at this in addition to all the other alternatives that exist. And since you don't know what those are, you can't really say it's safer. You might be able to say it's safer than the incumbent, but you can't say it's safer than other alternatives, right? So safer doesn't really mean anything without a universe of things you're comparing it to. But what you could say is maybe something like potentially acceptable. So we're not saying it's safer, whatever that means, but we're saying that it looks like it might be better than what we're trying to get rid of. We don't know. We haven't done the full analysis. We don't know enough about performance, so on and so. But it looks like it's potentially acceptable enough that AA manufacturers, you ought to look at it. And that's why I said this, I was thinking like, so if you did something like that, Kelly talks about copper all the time in conceptual models. I like to talk about the SNAP program and ozone depleting substances. And that's kind of what they do. They look at stuff and they say, oh, it looks somewhat better than the incumbent, but we're not saying it's safer. So if you did that, then I think it serves a function. It does kind of link people up, and it reduces some work along the lines, right? But if you don't do that, then to me, I'm not sure what the added value of it is. And let me tell you why. I know I'm going on and on, but this is my only comment. Okay. So here's what I'm thinking. So I tried to imagine, here's my theoretical, I'll call them my alternative manufacturer. And they've got this product, they see the work plan and they're like, wait a minute, our chemical could work here. I'm really interested. Or maybe they don't know about it and they need to be educated. So Pearl program does that call and says, hey, alternative manufacturers, you're looking for this, you do a lot of outreach, and you collect this set of people who would submit to Pearl. But do they really need to? If they're interested, instead what you might do is create a link where they can directly reach out to the REs, and you require that the REs, responsible entities, make a judgment, right? So what would happen there, right? The alternative manufacturer would reach out to the responsible party and say, I got this great thing, you know, so on and so forth. And the alternative, the RE would either look at it and make an initial judgment and then request data. And of course, if you're interested in getting your product, you're going to give them the data they need to do the AA, right? And you cut out the middleman, the DTSC middleman. They just have to submit it. Or the AA manufacturer says, I'm not interested, and they don't include them in the thing. So this is where I think maybe the other end, like Pearl could be backloaded. So instead of doubling your work, like looking at a hazard set initially and then looking at it again in the AA, you know, if the alternative manufacturer entices the AA, the RE to take the data, do the analysis, then DTSC is going to review that as part of the AA process, right? And you only have to do it once and it'll be fully aligned with like what you're looking at. If the manufacturer says, no, we're not interested, well, you know who you've sent to them. And then you could require them as part of the AA review to explain why it is this alternative was rejected. Was it for performance? And then you ask them for what they base their decision on. And if that seems kind of sketchy, what they respond, then you could ask the manufacturer to submit data. And you could do it, but you'd only have to do all this looking at the back end, only in those cases where your brokerage function didn't work. So I think that like there's two different ways I would think this could be more effectively implemented. One would be to add in some sort of screening function like potentially acceptable at the front end. The other would be to integrate it so that your brokerage is kind of a lighter touch. And then if you've got to get involved, you get involved later on, but only in those cases where your involvement is needed. Thanks.
Thank you, Tim. Elaine, you're up next.
Turning on the wrong things. Okay, this is an amazing conversation and my brain's overwhelmed. But I just, so I think, I'm trying to think what points to even follow on here. I guess since I just heard Tim, that's probably where I'll jump off from, but I guess, okay, so one of the things I'm struggling with is that in terms of the decisions, the regulatory actions that DTSC can make or the Safer Consumer Products Program can provide, you know, one of those is that an alternative is potentially available, but it's not market ready, right? So it's either, you know, there's still some performance issues, or there's certainly some of the more innovative, newer things may just not, you know, be available at scale. I mean, if it's not available, it's not available. You can't select that. But then the agency has the ability to make, you know, some decisions about research and other ways to move things forward. So if you you know, so just considering there's a range of options for how decisions are made, if before ever starting, somebody a regulated entity doing an AA can say, well, there is no alternative. You know, they can do the simplified AA because there's no alternatives, and then just move into this other area. This idea of brokering or requiring particular alternatives to be considered would mean you could require an alternative be considered that has stepped forward with minimal information and without saying that that's enough information to to come out at the end of the process as a viable alternative. But it in terms of what's being required of the regulated entity, how do you sort of identify early options or innovative things that aren't actually market ready, but could be interesting and worth considering? So I don't know, I'm not articulating this well at all, but I feel like there's an issue around how this, what is this minimal information supposed to represent? And having said that, that these chemical, I think I was thinking of this more as, again, in the chemical product space rather than chemicals available as alternatives for some, across some wide range of potential applications. So to me, this would be more compelling and more helpful if it really was submission of alternative chemicals in the context of a particular priority chemical product combination. So then the question is how do you, at what point in the process should you be making the call for these things? Can is there something in the work plan that can be signaling to some of the innovators that are working on alternative chemical product combinations or alternative safer products, that they could begin to be thinking about what they would need to do to qualify something for DTSC to say, yes, regulated entities, you do need to consider this. And oh, by the way, the alternative has this minimal set of data that isn't comprehensive and isn't going to fully get you where you need to go in your alternative assessment, but it's a good start. So we do require that you look at that. So I think I might, this is probably the most rambling, discordant set of ideas or thoughts. But yeah, so just this idea of which alternatives are you trying to enable or make available, or what kind of, is this a matchmaking thing? Is this an incubator space? So I'm just not sure that chemicals alone is going to get you all the way there unless you have some of this other context around it. I think longer term, like way out or whatever, based on the fact that you, DTSC, are already doing an incredible amount of work when you're doing the research on and when you're putting out what are the priority chemical product combinations, and then what are you're doing so much research and so much of this that at some point down the line, I could almost see you working with some of these alternative manufacturers or alternative innovators to do some kind of AA light that's has the essential elements for best practice AA, and that those almost were the things that you're certifying and putting out there. And then I'll just agree that some kind of third party, no matter what this ends up being or what you end up sharing and putting out there, some kind of third party verification. I'm just going to voice that I agree strongly with that. Thanks.
Thank you. So a quick comment here, based on something Elaine just said and something Tim said. This has been a very good discussion so far, and I know we're scheduled to end at 10:30. I've still got Emma, Helen, Heather, and Kelly. We will move break back a bit, so I don't want you to think you cannot talk. These comments have been good, so don't think, oh no, I've only got 14 seconds now. We'll adjust, don't worry. So Emma, you're up.
Thank you, Elaine, for going before. Thank you, Mateo, for the mic. Thank you, Elaine, for going before me because I was also sitting here with a set of somewhat disjointed thoughts. And then I think Kelly helped set me on the right track. First of all, I think all the points made are valid. Kelly raised the issue of the set of hazard criteria not being curated specifically for the chemical product combination for the priority product. And then she gave very good examples of the tire additive and the pesticide that would not, where that set of criteria would not raise the greatest environmental health hazards. So I want to point out 2 or 3 things here. One, I think that set of criteria is your base set of criteria to help avoid regrettable substitution, because you do need to focus on the functional use and the exposure scenario for that particular priority product. And that's part of what Tim was getting at. But you also don't want to ignore all the other endpoints, because that's when you get regrettable substitution. And then you'll have other optional endpoints you can add in for that specific scenario. So I just needed to refresh my memory a little bit on safer choice and skill, because I haven't worked in that program for a long time. But if you go to their website, I think it will help you frame this a little bit. Right there are the master criteria for safer chemical ingredients, which are strongly similar to what you've presented. And then there's functional class criteria, and then there's product class criteria. So the product class criteria expressly consider that use and exposure, set of exposure scenarios for particular types of products. So for example, they have microorganism-based products or ice melt products or safer marine lubricants, right? These can be very specific priority product areas. And I think that's what you need to use to frame your approach. So that, I think that's point number 1. A couple of other points that I haven't been able to think through really clearly yet are, you focus on a concern for a chemical in a product, so a specific functional use. But are you able to incorporate, should you consider incorporating an alternative product? Not just alternative chemical, and I don't know, I haven't thought about how the legislation is written and whether you can do that. But I'm kind of been in this space the last couple of days of thinking bigger picture. And I wouldn't want you to be so narrow that you're missing opportunities to enable safer, healthier choice for consumers. That's one idea to think about. I also want to acknowledge what Tim said about the integration of this with the alternatives assessment itself. That's like a whole other hour conversation, maybe. Leave it there. And then the current name of the concept program is PEARL, so it's potential emerging alternatives, which, right, is potential, is that right? Which oh no, it's not. Promoting transparency. I have it here. Promoting so many words. Promoting transparency. Emerging alternatives. Okay, emerging alternatives. So there's going to be a lot of, there may be alternatives out there that exist already in the market. And I'm just thinking from my experience working in flame retardants alternatives for many years, some time ago. And then there may be new chemistries. So I guess I'm getting at a little nuanced here. What do we mean by emerging alternatives and what's the opportunity here? Is this the traditional part of the alternatives assessment? Like what's available now that will work and that I can afford in the budget I have for this? Or are you, maybe I'm getting at that alternative product. Are we actually looking at an emerging alternative way of providing the function to the consumer? So this is getting a little bit big and vague, but I want to just put that on the table. Thank you.
Thank you, Emma. Helen?
I couldn't put my finger on it when I read the original briefing until Kelly started making her points. I couldn't put my finger on what I didn't like about this, what wasn't working. And it occurred to me as I was listening to people, I felt like it was 20 years ago, and we were trying to find quick and dirty ways of doing these assessments. There are no shortcuts here. There are no shortcuts. This panel has had this debate at least 4 times that I can remember. We tried it. We tried AATs. We tried all of these other things, other approaches. Is there some way? And every single time we asked ourselves this question, we came to the same conclusion that there are no shortcuts and everything must be held to the standard that is the standard that we set as the standard. And so even though I see that I see what you're trying to do and have been there 100%. I just think that anytime we try to do something like this, we always come back to the same point. And especially because you're going to be requiring entities to consider these alternatives. It sets up all of these potential moral hazard things that we're talking about. Things not being fully evaluated, not being fit for purpose, having all of these other things. The reason that we have the standards and the requirements that we have are literally to address every single one of the concerns that has come up today. And so the answer is to assess against all of the things that we have already established as being, the best practice for finding those alternatives. And related and sort of like to some of these points about like the functionality. Why do we pair those, right? There's good, solid reasoning that we always pair the chemical with the use. And so can you potentially can you look at the carcinogenicity in isolation and learn something? Sure, I mean, you can learn something about it, but you're not going to be able to really provide to a responsible entity a useful piece of information by just saying, here's a chemical that we're aware of that has less carcinogenicity. How does that really help them? That really doesn't serve the purpose. It doesn't help them to then force them to go and do that assessment. And so again, there's no shortcuts here. That whatever alternatives are going to have to meet the full set of requirements. And again, even in hazard screening, it's comparative alternatives assessment. Those of us, again, who've been doing this for a while, it's comparative assessment. And there's no way to do that in isolation. So I'm really sorry, I'm in the curmudgeon camp with Kelly, and I'm sorry for that, but I was just having this massive deja vu. I'm like, why am I feeling this deja vu? It's because we've had this debate many, many times.
Thank you, Helen. Heather?
Thanks, Helen. I personally struggle with what you were just talking about in the chemical hazard assessment space, and wanted to offer how I've been thinking about the difference between the first step, like what do we know about a chemical's potential hazards? I think about that as characterizing a chemical, the characterization of the hazards. What must we know before we can move forward in making that next step decision? And that next step is optimizing that chemical. Is it optimized for use? Is it safer? And those criteria are bespoke. And I think that there's obviously value in sharing the characterization data, but that optimization question really is where we get stuck. And I think that that's what a lot of the folks here are talking about. And I wanted to go back to Tim's point, and I'll speak to the one that was hazard-based because that's where I work. But I really did like the idea of if there is a listing of a potential alternative, understanding the hazards associated with the incumbent or the candidate chemical is really key. It goes back to Kelly's point. If we know that something is hazardous at a nanogram level, like we don't just want something that's not category 1 for aquatic toxicity. Can it be toxic at the microgram level? Is that safer enough? I think is a question that will have to be morally posed if we're putting together a repository of potential alternatives. It reminded me of the within class criteria at the Washington State Ecology, how they think about a testing out of a phthalate, for example. They identify the hazards associated with the chemical class of phthalates, and then to say it's a potentially safer phthalate. Whether or not that's a minimum criteria endpoint, if it's carcinogenicity or if it's endocrine, because we know phthalates have endocrine activity, that then becomes a required endpoint for the assessment of any alternative to a phthalate. And I think that that's what you were speaking to, Tim, and we could look to some examples there. I think doing that strengthens the carrot of requiring that alternative to be included in the assessment. If we say we have reason to believe that it is safer than the candidate chemical because we looked at the candidate chemical's hazards, assessed that they are of lower hazard, plus those minimum like criteria to play, right? So we avoid those regrettable substitutions in a different area. So I really liked your point, Tim. Just wanted to amplify that.
This is super quick. I'm responding to Tim's idea that kind of takes DTSC out of the loop and kind of highlighting something that Julie was raising. One of the things that I found in my career is that the quality of toxicity test data is quite variable, and that it is very helpful to have some sort of third-party evaluation of the actual data. And I'm not clear that that's actually going to be possible through the AA process. So one advantage I see here is having the department take a look at that. And my example for that is in my many years working in pesticides, I could actually tell, I mean, in addition to looking at the tests or seeing the presentation on whatever the toxicity test on, I mean, you could just see the bad quality, but you could actually tell if they wanted a good result, high quality result or not by which lab they sent it to. It was really that bad in the pesticide world. So just don't underestimate the value of having the department do some QA.
Okay, and Mateo.
Yeah, thanks. Sorry for so many comments today, but what Helen said about there are no shortcuts just brought up another ideal question for me, and it also builds on what Tim was saying, because I think, you know, the way it's positioned right now, Pearl is sort of at the beginning of the process, and maybe there's some brokerage that can happen. But when it comes to promotion, right, like the P in Pearl, right, shouldn't that happen like after, right? Like after the alternatives assessment at the very end, right? Like after we've gone through everything, and you're starting with the tires, right? For a reason, because, you know, you've maybe found some alternatives that are worth promoting, right? Like, and I don't know. I was just thinking like that's maybe something to look into. Is there opportunities to promote alternatives after the alternative assessment has happened that, you know, could benefit manufacturers that use them, could, you know, maybe highlight suppliers of the chemicals, and or, you know, like have these publications be reviewed, you know, and outside of California, right?
Okay, Andre, and then we will close it up.
It's super interesting. I was just kind of thinking that this concept isn't as a replacement for the AA. So it seems to me that even if the data provided by the chemical manufacturer doesn't hit all of the points that we're concerned about, that doesn't relieve the product manufacturer of having all of that data. So this isn't a substitute or a shortcut around our process. I don't know if that makes a difference. But just thought that was just something going through my head.
Great. Okay, so I'm
make a point about what Mateo was saying before you close it up. So I actually have a question. So when you're talking about promotion coming at the end, that's just for viable alternatives, right? But what about the concept, as I was reading the, papers and stuff, of actually promoting the development of, that would come at the beginning, right?
Yeah, and I think to Tim's point, maybe there is like some kind of brokerage, to the function that can happen, but probably what can't happen is sort of the promotion, right?
Okay, this was a very good discussion. Thank you, and thank you for staying late on your break. But I especially want to say thank you to Kim for sitting up at the table. It might not be comfortable, but engaging in the discussion, answering questions as you went. You did an excellent job. The whole team did an excellent job, but I know it can be tough sitting up at the table in the midst of a very
It's no
robust
worse than we've
discussion,
heard
so thank
before.
you.
We've been asked, do we need the Pearl at all? So I appreciate all of this insight for sure. So thank you.
Okay, thank you. Alex, I'll let you take us to break.
Yes, we're gonna break now for about 15-ish minutes. It's 10:42 right now, so let's try to aim to be back here 10:58. 10:58 on the dot. Hello. Welcome back from break. Getting fancy with the jingles on a Friday. Hope everyone stretched their legs and hydrated. It is hot out there. We will be shifting gears a little bit. SCP is really excited for this next hour of roundtable talking. So I'm just going to pass it straight over to Molly to get started with this.
Thanks, Alex. Hope you all had some insightful conversations, not about these topics, of course, but about the world that we live in and each other. Always nice to connect with colleagues. And we're going to do a little bit more show and tell right now. As I mentioned, as we went through some agenda reviews, this last portion of our agenda is really just mini TED Talks, mini webinars, mini, probably no more than 5 minutes each, given that we do want to kind of keep this session to an hour. But the staff, the program, and I think each other here on this panel are really interested just to hear of each other's work that interfaces with the goals of the program, with the challenges of the program, with the opportunities of this program, and learn a little bit more about each other's work. More also, it might raise some topics to consider in future GRASP meetings or future projects or research that the staff might take on, but also knowing to go to as an asset and a resource on various topics and exposing kind of that knowledge base in this panel. And so for no other reason, I don't think we've kind of considered how best to do this, but I think we should just go around the room. And unfortunately, I don't think we're going to have a lot of time for conversation about each other's work because we really do want to hear about, but let's just see how that goes. Let's go around the room. And if you all have questions or want to pose some issues, hold them. Let's see if we have time at the end, and then we'll go back and have some greater conversation. Yes. Elaine, we just want to make sure, and Julie, if you're there, want to make sure that you're part of this. So why don't we have you all go first, if that's okay?
Sure. I can.
Okay, you're up, Julie.
I
Thank
can
you.
volunteer to go first. Sure.
Okay, thank you so much.
And if you don't mind, since I had to sign off from the earlier session, I did have just 2 comments about the Pearl that I'd like to share as well, if I may. And that is, before I had to sign off, I heard a lot of people highlighting some of the things that Pearl can't do. And as a user of hazard data, and I teach students to try to find data and use data, I want to make sure that SCP doesn't get caught up in the trying to make it perfect before they do Pearl. There's a bit of a tension between non-experts finding access to information that maybe isn't the highest quality or isn't complete. But there's also the side of just not finding any data at all. So I want to commend SCP for the idea of Pearl and encourage you to move forward with it as aggressively as you can, because getting data out there in the public, I think is really important. Any way to put information about quality is also important. The other thing I wanted to highlight is, well, I'll just go on then back to the question that I was asked, and that is my background. So just a reminder, I'm on the faculty at Texas A&M University in Department of Material Science and Engineering. And I've been with the Green Ribbon Science Panel since its formation when I was back at UC Davis at that time. So my reach goal for all of this time has been to try to find better ways to help engineers, scientists to make better decisions about the materials they use, the chemicals they use, the products they make from the perspective of sustainability in a very broad definition, but focused on not making things that fit sustainable technologies. That's not enough. We need to make things that support and create sustainable technologies that are sustainable in and of themselves, so that the materials we're using for solar panels, for batteries, for vehicles, for consumer products, all of that, that we do take into account chemical hazard, other environmental impacts, et cetera. And so the holy grail for me has been to figure out how to get that kind of information in a format and usable access, so that those who are the non-experts, the people like my students, my colleagues, who don't want to know what the difference is between an endocrine disruptor and a carcinogen and a mutagen, they don't speak that language, but to help them understand that those are important traits that they should be accounting for in their material selection and product and manufacturing design. And so I'm optimistic because I've seen the world change a lot in 20 years in terms of availability of data, type of data, the ability for people to speak to these questions and speak to them well and in an informed way. Helen made a comment yesterday back in the engaging with people early in the product work plan development. And I think young people are definitely excited about these things, they're engaged in these questions. And so finding ways to reach out to student populations, I think is an important strategy that our community as a whole should be trying to do more of. And I would encourage SCP to continue to publish as many papers as they can possibly get under their belt, because these resources have longevity, whereas other things sometimes disappear. But journal papers are things that people can go back and read and learn from and see how the discipline has changed, see how to implement these strategies. So I think I mentioned at our December meeting, I use the AA guide in my class. It's assigned reading. But the journal papers are sometimes more tangible. They're a little bit more focused. And so I would strongly encourage that. I'll stop with that. Thank you.
Thank you, Julie. Elaine, do we still have you?
I am here.
Great.
Can you hear me?
Yep.
Okay, so I am with the United States Environmental Protection Agency, Office of Research and Development, where I've been for the better part of my career. and have always conducted mission-driven research. So I say that because what we do is really very applied and focused on enabling agency decisions to protect human health and the environment, promote human health. And all my background degrees are in chemical engineering, but I somehow fell into exposure science. And so that's really been the domain that much of my work has been in. Most recently, I've led research that's focused on understanding human exposures to PFAS chemicals. PFAS, let me say that, it's redundant. And direct work with a team of analytical chemists and data scientists, and we've been developing information on real-world PFAS occurrence, hoping to get more insights on, what is anthropogenic background, what is, where do we need to do better monitoring, and we've partnered and leveraged a lot of samples in terms of tap water and house dust and other kind. I've focused a lot on residential exposures to get at understanding of what are other sources of exposure beyond the industrial releases. And so that's what I've been doing most recently. But I've worked in a wide range of areas in the Office of Research and Development and across different program offices in the agency. And I guess I'm probably one of the Green Ribbon Science Panel people that came about in the middle. So I wasn't here at the beginning, but I've been here longer than all the new people. And it's just been a really interesting evolution to watch, and I've really appreciated being a part of that. And I think right now, one of the things over the course of my many years, being on the research side, I never have had the opportunity to actually be a regulator, and it's a really different kinds of pressures, different kinds of expectations. But I also should say that I started my career really on the modeling side, including my PhD work was modeling contaminant transport in the respiratory tract, and the focus was on formaldehyde. And so we all know how many years later, and that was with the Chemical Industry Institute of Toxicology was where I did that, my dissertation. And we all know that years later, we're still working on formaldehyde. And so in that context, one of the things that, I've been really interested in is how do we use the best information we have to move forward, make decisions, not not double down on mistakes. And then going forward, I think, I started working again more recently with real measurements and just seeing that that's where our program offices struggle is when, there isn't data. And we've heard similar conversations today. So I'm in a stage and phase where I just really am advocating for more measurement. And I'm extremely excited about some of the possibilities and the newer methodologies and technologies that are, I think, enabling much better surveillance. And we can only know what we know and do the best assessment we can do given what we know. But to imagine that we won't learn new things or find new problems is difficult to imagine. And I think we can start to do real surveillance, and I see that as a potential role for government, whether it be in doing that surveillance or in leading consortiums or whatever to get this surveillance done. And I think we've got really good history of how measuring air pollution has been incredibly informative and has guided and supported a lot of decisions that have improved health and well-being. And I'm hoping to see a lot more of that in other environmental media and in other and again a lot into the built environment where we're introducing all kinds of changes in how we live and in the products that we use. So I guess I'll leave it at that. Thank you.
Thank you, Elaine. Let's go to Suzanne. And I am just watching our time. I mentioned about 5 minutes. It's probably more like 3 minutes that we each have. So
I'm putting my phone in front of me so I know what time it is. Hi, everyone. Suzanne Brander. I am an associate professor at Oregon State University. I'm in the College of Agricultural Sciences there, and I've been there since 2017. I joined GRSP in, I think it was the end of 2020. So during the pandemic, I don't think I met anyone in person for about a year and a half. I am trained as a toxicologist. I did my PhD at UC Davis. And a lot of my focus has been on the study of mechanisms of toxicity in aquatic organisms. A lot of my focus is on marine, but I also look at freshwater. And as we've delved more into microplastics, we're now even getting to things I never thought I would get into, like biosolids. Won't talk much about that, but it's quite interesting. But anyway, a lot of the challenges that our work and collaborative work have highlighted is that there's never a simple answer. You have nonlinear responses. You have some organisms that are more sensitive than others, a lot of variability. When you're studying chemicals that have specific targets, like endocrine disrupting chemicals that we know bind to specific receptors, but then it gets even more complex when you're thinking about things like micro and nanoplastics, which have both the physical and chemical toxicity sometimes happening simultaneously, depending on what combinations you're looking at. Something I would really like to see move forward, and I think there's a lot of momentum for this, at least there was in the US. There still is quite a bit of momentum globally for moving towards making microplastics a candidate chemical. I know that has been proposed, but it's difficult to get that to move forward. So it's still in progress. But I think that anything that safer consumer products can do to align themselves with what's being at least pushed for the plastics treaty, for an effective treaty, things that groups that are talking about chemicals that are part of the Scientist Coalition for an Effective Treaty, I think would be really beneficial to trying to get that moved forward, even during a difficult political climate. And then another goal, aside from just thinking about micro and nanoplastics, is, and we kind of touched on this a little bit when we were talking about Pearl, but aiming for more holistic ways to evaluate chemicals. And again, it's easy for me to say that because I'm not a regulator and I'm not faced with a lot of the challenges that you're faced with. I can say this is bad, and then there's a lot of difficulties figuring out how to proceed with that. But the more we can think holistically about chemicals, moving away from the one chemical at a time approach, the whack-a-mole approach, to grouping, which is really where plastic chemical regulation is being pushed to head towards regulating by groups rather than regulating by single chemicals. Just the more I think we can align with those types of priorities, and it'll be less reinventing the wheel maybe in some ways, because a lot of that information is out there and is being discussed in the context of the treaty and other chemical regulation. And lastly, I just wanted to mention that I was really happy last week. We were finishing up the draft of a paper, and a colleague of mine from the EU insisted that we add the Safer Consumer Products Alternatives Assessment on 6-PPD as a citation and as an example of a push in the right direction in our paper on plastics chemicals regulation. So I'll just leave it at that.
Great place to leave it. Matteo.
Hello, Matteo Kausch. My academic background is in environmental science. I did my PhD. It's kind of focused on biogeochemistry, mostly at UC Berkeley. My research was about selenium contamination in California, but I also did some work with Berkeley Center for Green Chemistry, and actually Helen at the time was our sponsor from HP, then I was the technical director for Cradle Cradle Certified for 8 years and helped further define and develop the material health assessment methodology for that standard. And now I lead sustainability for the Amazon devices supply chain. So that's the Amazon business unit that makes the branded consumer electronic products, Kindle, Echo, Fire TV, Ring, Blink, Eero. And so there, we are a Chem Forward co-design partner. So that's the most, I think, relevant work to this panel. But a big focus of ours is also on decarbonization to support Amazon's climate pledge to be net zero by 2040. So my team works with suppliers to transition to renewable energy and decarbonize the supply chain.
Thank you, Mateo. Emma.
Thank you, Emma Lavoie. My original training and interests are in biology, and I have a PhD in biomedical sciences because that was the PhD program that was available to those of us who wanted to do toxicology. But that was a blessing because it's an interdisciplinary program. So my interest in conservation and environmental pollution led me to ecotoxicology, and I worked in environmental toxicology with research in a lot of those old toxics, organic chlorines. In particular, my work was actually in birds in the Great Lakes, where I was doing immunotoxicology, so I have background in immunology, toxicology, endocrine disruption. In my postdoc, I moved more into endocrine disruption and also aging, immunosenescence. So I have a diversity of lab and field experience. And then I moved to the EPA, where I got involved in green safer chemistry and hazard assessment because I joined what is now the Safer Choice program. So my expertise is really in that assessment space, whether it's hazard characterization, hazard screening, hazard comparison, risk assessment, or more recently, cumulative impacts assessment. I have knowledge also in systematic review, which is an important assessment approach for rigorous and quality science assessment. I worked on flame retardants alternatives assessments at EPA and was adjacent to a lot of other chemistries that we were assessing. I have recently participated in the Federal Sustainable Chemistry Strategy Team that I know was a co-author on the first report to Congress. There are now 2 reports to Congress. And currently I'm a research program director, health and environmental risk assessment, and that research encompasses both doing assessments that will be used by the agency, but also approaches to making hazard assessment and models and tools, whether that's statistical or biological or software that's designed to make the process go faster. All of those are included in the program. Thank you.
Thank you. And wow, so far. Before I start, I just really want to acknowledge the DTSC staff team here. The purpose of this is to tell you about me, but honestly, I get more from interacting with you all than I think you could ever possibly get from me. It's just been amazing to get to know the folks who've dedicated their lives to public service for our state. And I have a lot of gratitude, and especially for the learning that I've done from you. I look at the familiar faces and I'm aware of your work and your publications, even if you don't know that. So thank you very much. So quickly, my PhD is actually in electrochemistry, which has absolutely nothing to do with anything that I do other than the ability to learn how to organize my thinking and to be really critical about data, because there wasn't a PhD available at that time in the fields that I wanted being interested in. But I have spent my career at the science policy interface and bringing good science to policy decisions around management of pollution, particularly water pollution, particularly in urban areas. And that work quickly led me to products being the primary source that we really haven't addressed because of the slate of environmental laws over the years. One way or another, products seem to be a main source of pollution for both humans and water. And I have served in advisory roles and am serving in advisory roles for almost every Cali PA agency. I think OE has the sole exception that's evaded me so far. So I've done a lot of work around the years. I've been around since Cali PA was formed. And actually in the early days of the P2 program, I was the sponsor for legislation that expanded the P2 program. I chaired the Pollution Prevention Advisory Committee, as I mentioned a long time ago. And was involved in the legislative development for the Safer Consumer Products Program law, as well as being members, as several other folks are here, of this committee since its inception, where it was an absolute privilege to be able to weigh in on helping the department develop a framework, an approach to this program that was meaningful, practical, and defensible. And so it's really exciting to be able to continue to support the program's implementation, and just so exciting to see how it's expanded. As most of you know, and only the new staff don't know, I spent forever working on water pollution from vehicle brake pads. And it's a good case study example of all the things that were wrong with our system that we're trying to right through this program, as well as a really great way of seeing a lot of mistakes that we make in the way we organize our thinking around pollution from products. Similarly, I spent decades working with the Department of Pesticide Regulation, which has completely restructured its process around regulating pesticides and preventing water pollution. And I really want to honor the scientists there and some of the folks at EPA that I worked with, because they both taught me a lot and have done a lot in some really, really difficult situations that influence my input to this program. And I always am trying to connect you all. And I think you guys have done a really good job of continuing to do that. I'm currently at the San Francisco Estuary Institute, where I work with some really amazing scientists. And I'm glad that we have a pretty strong relationship with the department. I'll just highlight, I'm working on emerging contaminants, microplastics, and specifically tires, which integrate both of those things at once. And we're doing this really, really cool, the San Francisco Bay Water Quality Improvement Fund did project called a PFAS Sources to Solutions, where DTSC is a key partner. And we're seeking to identify those products that are most likely to be contributing PFAS to make the fish in San Francisco Bay unsafe to eat. And also similarly, we're finding huge amounts of PFAS in urban runoff. So urban runoff and wastewater pathways have been a focus of mine, and there's a lot of human exposures associated with those same products. So it's a pretty holistic kind of thing. In closing, that the questions asked us for thoughts about where the program might go. And there's two things I've been thinking a lot about. So one is that it would be very helpful for the program to continue to identify and publicize its information needs. So it was private conversations that led us to applying for the grant in partnership with DTSC to fill that information gap around which products contain PFAS. And the staff were the ones who told us, gee, one of the reasons that we can't go going here is we don't have enough information about PFAS in products in California and which ones are most important. I would love you guys to be making those calls in presentations at science conferences all over the place. Because if you give scientists, really just worldwide scientists, specific information needs, I've been so impressed at how people will go out and find their own money and respond to those information needs and share them. And so I think the department could do a lot more in that area. The second area that I'd really, really like to work on before I finish my career is developing a list of chemicals that are hazardous from the environmental perspective, probably the aquatic perspective, that's akin to the lists for human health. And I think we're at a point where there's enough information available that if we pulled together a team of toxicologists to do that and publish a paper, I think that could happen, but funding is needed for that. So if anyone is interested in this, it's something I want to think about. I know a few toxicologists to start with here in California, and I think it would be something that would make a really big difference for this program to have that hazard list, which we could then compare against exposure data to help prioritize products that affect the non-human environment. Thank you.
Yeah, Art. I just wanted to say your name for those that are listening.
Okay. Hi, my name's Art Fong, and I am the technical leader for Smarter Chemistry at Apple. Smarter Chemistry is one of our 3 environmental priorities, along with climate change and resources. Because Mateo mentioned the fact that Amazon is, targeting 2040 for carbon neutrality. I just want to do a plug saying that, in fact, Apple is already carbon neutral for our facilities. And we aim to be carbon neutral for our operations by 2030.
Throwing it down.
And I noticed, people were talking about the PhD, work. I don't remember what my PhD research was, and that's a really good indication of the value of a UC education. Again, I'm the technical leader for Smarter Chemistry, and Smarter Chemistry is where we use chemistry innovations to ensure that our products and the making of our products are safe for our workers, our customers, our recyclers, and better for the environment. So I don't do kind of pure research that Elaine and other people are doing. In terms of like research related, what I'm doing right now is working with a university partner and with an NGO to really try to develop the concept of using informatics, specifically AI, machine learning, and big data analysis to try to solve some of the really challenging environmental chemistry type problems. So we last November published a paper on building a roadmap for safer and sustainable material chemistry, addressing the PFAS problem through informatics and data-driven chemistry in MRS, energy, and sustainability. So, and we're expanding on that. Again, so the idea in terms of like, what we're trying to do is to build the algorithms and the platforms such that it would make it really make it easier for engineers and material scientists to think about when they're developing the next generation of materials, how to incorporate the safer and sustainability features without sacrificing performance and avoiding the hazardous properties. So again, AI, informatics, and machine learning using those tools. And I think those tools are just going to become more and more, valuable and important. So I think that's an area that SCP, if you're not focusing or putting effort into that, definitely consider doing so. And because Helen and Ann mentioned the Safer Chemistry Impact Fund, little plug on that is Apple provided the seed money to actually kick that off. And that's an idea that Mike Warner at Google and I have been kicking around along with Stacy Glass at Chem Forward, basically really trying to advance science-based, data-driven solutions to eliminating the use of hazardous chemicals with verified safer alternatives. And that's been, and actually Heather gave a bit of an introduction on some of the projects, that have resulted from the Safer Chemistry Impact Fund. A couple of other things that I'm doing is to really try to promote the next generation of leaders in safe and sustainable chemistry. So Apple has been working with Beyond Benign and provided them with a grant to really expand the MSI, Minority Serving Institute outreach So the idea for that is how I pitched it to my executives was that we wanted to expand the talent pool of Black, Hispanic, and Indigenous, engineers and scientists for the next generation of leaders. And that will provide a expanded pipeline into leadership and, work at companies like Apple and Google and other high-tech companies. So that's one thing we're doing. Another thing we're doing in terms of promoting the next generation of leaders is that we're currently working with Change Chemistry to try to develop a program to promote early career scientists and engineers at businesses so they can become leaders and then really change how companies think about sustainability and a safe and sustainable chemistry. Let's see what else. A bunch of other stuff that's related to working with Chem Forward, working with ChemSec, and that's related to Kelly's point about the kind of like developing good lists. The good lists, they're only good if they're really specific in pointing to you where something can be used. Because again, most of the things like PFAS, they're so application specific, and also for solvents too, that just because you have a good list and you try to use it for your stuff, and that's why the adoption or uptake of safer chemistry sometimes is so slow because people get discouraged. Oh, I'm sorry. Some material selection decision makers in companies, they get discouraged. They go to what's a good list and they try them out, and none of them work. So I think I've talked enough. Thanks.
Thank you, Art. All right, Mike, please.
Okay, so Mike Carangello, I do not have a PhD. You guys always amaze me with the brilliance on the panel. And I've said that, for a number of years that I just feel stupid half the time, but I struggle through. And I want to echo what Kelly said about the staff. For a number of years, I think even before I was on the panel, I participated since before the panel even existed on the public side. I was sitting on the side where the public could make comments before I was invited to join. But I have been willing to and been engaged with the staff when there have been specific topics of interest. And I don't think that the staff truly realizes how enjoyable it is for me to be able to talk to them because they work on a totally flip side that I do, and how much information I get back. It is a vast pleasure. I had a meeting this week and it was fascinating to me. We're going to continue talking that topic, so the staff here is just simply amazing. It has been through the years and it continues as you've brought the right people in as you continue to grow and expand, and I greatly appreciate it. What my background is I started out as a research chemist in a wide variety of areas, from both chemical manufacture to formulation of consumer products. So it could be cleaners, it could be cosmetics, drug products, medical devices, the whole gamut. I moved into, from that spot, a more regulatory role. I became the TSCA coordinator when TSCA became a thing. Started authoring MSDSs. Later in my career, I had the joy of trying to translate MSDSs over to GHS documents and figure out how that was going to work. For a while, then I moved into technical services, so consulting with our customers about what products of ours they should use, or if our products didn't fit. I was lucky enough in the chemical, I worked for two very large chemical companies, and they had sustainability in mind. So we could work, and we made some chemicals that we forbid now, but that's decades ago. But being part of the chemical industry, I not only was then a formulator, technical sales, moved into that environmental role, into managing health, industrial hygiene, worker safety. I've held those roles as well in the chemical industry. and again, throughout a broad gamut of chemical types. And I know, so drugs, active drugs, not something the department deals with, but on that cosmetic side, I know you've got DPR sitting there, but pesticidal products, pesticidal actives, and looking at the endpoints of those. I then moved into the consumer products world. First company I was with did baby products, did paper products, a lot of environmental issues when you manufacture paper, that's for sure. Medical devices, ran the whole gamut. The company I'm currently with, SC Johnson, we are consumer products that are an extremely broad breadth. We manufacture globally, so it's impossible to make the same product in 2 different countries because your suppliers, you're going to supply locally. So how do you evaluate? Because is any person's health and safety or the environment in a different country any less valuable than here in the US? And it's not. So how do we manage to make sure we do that evaluation across the board? My role was regulatory. First it was US, then it was North America, then it was global, then I moved to Latin America, then I took all of the Americas. My role now is in quality, and I work good manufacturing practices for our plants, is my official role, though my title is Strategic Corporate Initiative, so I can touch anything. And so any sort of manufacturing related issues, while I don't work in manufacturing, I work with manufacturing, so I can talk on those topics. And I also want to go back to the concept that I think Suzanne brought up of microplastics. We need to look into them as much as we can. It's very hard for industry to get away from them. Plastics are so much part of our lives. But I think the more studies we can do on that, the better off we are. And I hope I kept to 3 minutes.
I'm not really tracking, but hi, everybody. So Molly Jacobs. So both of your chairs don't have PhDs, but I think we're rocking it regardless. In undergrad, I actually was one of these people that were working in an environmental toxicology lab for a number of years and funded by the San Francisco Estuary Bay Institute, looking at PCBs and persistent pesticides in the bay. And in that world, there were 2 things that happened to me. One, I was thinking, gosh, this is interesting. I'm using so many toxic solvents to study toxic chemistries. I was like, is that what's going on here? And the other observation that I had was one of being very anthropocentric. I was looking at, marine mammals and fish and mussels, and I was thinking, well, how is this affecting me? Found my way to public health, going back to get my graduate program in public health, and studied environmental epidemiology. And I worked at the state for a number of years, conducting disease cluster evaluations, and found myself once again asking a question: why are we still using these chemistries? They're causing all sorts of, I'm telling family members, yeah, it looks like there's, this chemical probably could have caused your son's cancer. But from an epidemiologic perspective, we don't really have the numbers to show statistical significance, but yet we're still using these chemistries, right? So I found myself wanting to move upstream. So like Kelly, for the last probably 15 years of my career, I've been working more at that science policy interface, trying to work on these issues of the transition to safer chemistries. We have the knowledge of the harm. Why aren't we moving? And I work as our director of applied research at the University of Massachusetts Lowell, part of a research center there called the Wilson Center for Sustainable Production, where we work on the issues of barriers to this transition. And I love working on this panel because my whole world really in the last number of years is about alternatives assessment, alternatives analysis, about barriers to substitution. We have a lot of contracts with state, like the Government of Canada, the European Commission, And what I can say is there is a very strong focus, more so than there ever was 15 years ago, on substitution. There's a lot of infrastructure, a lot of policy analysis that is being done in the space to better optimize how we do this. And one of the things that I keep harboring on, both from this experience of this panel and learning from this program, and like Kelly and like Mike, I'm taking so much in from this program because it's applying directly to my own work and research. But is this issue of, while I am a huge proponent of alternatives analysis and alternatives assessment, it only works in this process if you do it early, right? So like how this is true, what we're seeing in Europe, there's a lot of conversation of how can that under REACH, these assessments be done earlier, not in the auspices of asking for an authorization, but when something is an SVHC, how can you get people to do these assessments then? How can you get people to do these assessments when you list a priority product? Not when you ask for the process of the alternatives assessment, because again, we want to know when they're making these adjustments, when they're making these replacements, that they're doing it thinking about everything that we want them to think about, right? So illuminating a lot of barriers to what's going on, from capacity needs, from knowledge and awareness, and there's a lot of effort in this space. So California is not alone. We're actually working right now with the Commission for Environmental Cooperation, which is the governments of Canada, the US, and Mexico, to think through an informed substitution center that would be tri-national. So there's a lot of interest in this, and so it's just a matter of keep on keeping on. With that, I'll send it to Heather.
Thanks, Molly. We are on a no PhD streak. I'm the third no PhD, and then we're on a 2 MPH streak, I think, at this point. So my training is that I have a master's of public health in environmental health and a bachelor's in environmental science, and came to the work very similarly to a lot of folks here in thinking about the products that we bring into our homes and how they can impact our health and the environment around us. And I do think I probably have the shortest CV, so I'll try to be quick. But before joining Kim Forward, I was at The Honest Company, leading toxicology and product safety, which is a consumer packaged goods company that focuses on formulated goods for babies, pregnant people, adult personal care, beauty products, cleaning products, diapers. I think we touched a little bit of every type of consumer product while I was there, also drug products, when we start to think about SPF, et cetera. And so in leading that team, I had pretty strong dotted lines to clinical safety testing, but also efficacy testing, claims, regulatory, legal. I feel like a lot of what Mike said also applies to my background as well. Did a lot of work in third-party certifications there. So playing both in the beauty and personal care space and the cleaning space, got exposure to things like Safer Choice, CWG verified, and those processes. And because of the focus on pregnancy and pregnancy safe products, I did get to work closely with the March of Dimes Mom and Baby Action Network while I was at Honest, and continue serving in that capacity. So in my current role at Kim Forward, I'm the Science and Safer Chemistry lead, and I have the task of trying to fill the shoes of Dr. Lauren Hine, which absolutely nobody could possibly do. So I've picked up a lot of the work that she has rolled off. And so really just starting to think about how we can start to fill this data problem when it comes to chemical hazards. So really our focus is in data generation and scaling through comprehensive chemical hazard assessments in a data repository that can then be used. So as I mentioned earlier, this concept of characterization, characterizing the chemicals so that the information can then be packaged and assessed in ways that is most useful for the application. So that concept of optimizing using bespoke criteria, we really aim to give you that first step of the endpoint characterization per all of these applicable endpoints, but also some of those harder to quantify things like impurities, like environmental transformation products, and populating it in a shared repository that can then be queried by the users is one of the things we are constantly working through. And we're working with our data partners like Art and like Mateo and other users of the platform to understand, what are you really searching for? If you're looking for a safer alternative to a hazardous solvent, then you really need to know the solubility of the potential alternatives to know if it's even worth considering. So adding in the right physical chemical properties as well, so that that can be queried, is something that we're continually working through with our user-centered design. So I oversee the existing framework. So currently we have GHS and Cradle to Cradle in the system. So really trying to understand what is appropriate for the classification under those GHS-based methodologies, but also incorporating emerging best practices. We've all mentioned that mobility is not represented in these existing methodologies. So how can we at ChemForward capture the criteria like CLP is written for mobility, for endocrine? And how do we start to work in some of these areas that are in that gray, messy middle, like polymer assessments? It's really challenging to look at polymers at the base. It's impossible to look at polymers at the base polymer level. We really need to know something about impurities, residual monomer content, et cetera. So really trying to get the right data in users' hands so that they are supported to then apply risk-based or alternatives assessment-based criteria so they can make decisions. I will also just add to Art's work on Beyond Benign the next generation of safer chemistry green chemists. We also support that program, and we've developed modules and are trying to get funding so that we can get the ChemForward platform into more classrooms for free access. So if anybody wants to continue to fund that, please let me know. We would love to get this in more classrooms so that students can be exposed sooner to this concept of safer and green chemistry.
Okay. Thank you, Heather. And we've got Tim.
Thank you. Also not a PhD. Yo. Yeah. So my name's Tim Malloy. I'm a professor at UCLA in the School of Law and the Institute of Environment and Sustainability. So my background is law, obviously. So before coming to UCLA, I spent about 8 years in private practice and 5 years at US EPA. At EPA, I did enforcement, permitting, and Superfund cleanups. And in private practice, I did the same, and also some a fair amount of transactional work. As a lawyer, I always felt like what my clients were doing was way more interesting than what I did. And I have the same feeling here on this panel. It's like I'm fascinated by what the panelists do and what you as staff all do. I mean, it's just like such a thrill to be here. Okay. So if you had to put what I do kind of like in a tagline or something, most of the work, I've been at UCLA for about 28 years, and for about 25 of them, most of my work's been focused on this question. What would regulation look like if we took the notion of prevention? It used to be prevention, now I think most people call it substitution, but if you took it seriously and tried to embed it into regulatory programs, what would that look like? So a lot of my work's on regulatory design. It's also on organizational theory, what makes companies and other institutions, including agencies, function, how do they make decisions and whatnot. But it was all tied into this question of prevention. And ultimately, in order to answer that question, it became clear that you had to have a way of comparing things in order to get to substitution, which was AA, which I got into like 20 years or so ago. And then ultimately that pared down to, well, that's all about decision making, which is where I've spent a lot of my work in the last, let's say, 10 to 15 years. Here's what I'm doing now. I just finished a paper on decision making in government agencies, and the idea was to generalize a lot of the work that I've been doing here and in just prevention generally to all the other kinds of decisions agencies, primarily environmental agencies, make: strategic, operational, tactical. And it uses a Superfund decision making at EPA as kind of a case study, and then does a thought experiment of like, what would a program look like if you implemented structured decision making, and how would that change? So it looks at things like legitimacy, accountability, effectiveness, so on and so forth. Picked a bad time to do it because, these days not many people are thinking about careful, thoughtful decision making at the federal level. So I may adjust that and, maybe go look at a state level example. But that paper is done, and I learned a lot from it that broadened my concepts of decision making, which is reflected in 2 projects I'm working on right now I want to tell you about real quickly. So the first one looks at regrettable substitution, because one thing I've noticed is we have a lot of great programs out there trying to move us away from bad stuff. They're not doing such a great job at the back end on the regrettable substitution. So I've looked at these programs and kind of categorized them into 3 models. So there's the one model is we ban things based on an AA, but we don't kind of follow up with where people go after that. The second model is we ban, or I say ban, maybe you restrict them in some way, but we ban based on an AA, but we try to track the replacement chemicals or what they've done. And I think actually the SCP program is what I'm using as an exemplar of that sort of model. It's not completely on all fours. And then the last model is we ban, plus we look for and require some sort of oversight or approval of the replacement, which is not used very much. And you can probably know what I'm going to say next. Everybody with me? SNAP program. Okay, thank you, Molly. I saw you mouthing it, but you didn't have the nerve to say it. Okay, so where that paper is taking me right now, and I'd like to talk to you, Art, about what you mentioned before about the stuff you're doing on SAFER, is that number one, this notion of front end, back end AA. It's like cowbell. We need more cowbell. I think we need more AA. So we need that front end AA for deciding whether we can ban something. And then maybe we need sort of a back end AA for the replacements. And those two things should look different because they're serving different functions and they require different. So that's what the whole paper is about, is like, what would this look like? How do these models work? What would it look like if we did that? I'm running out of time, or I'm past time. So I'll just finish with this three last things. The other thing I'm thinking about is the decision, like AA tends to think about finding the best alternative. So now I'm really thinking about this dichotomy of good enough versus best, or satisfice versus optimize. And it plays into that paper I'm working on. The other thing I'm interested in is I served as the chair of a technical committee of an EP chemicals of concern standard, which was mind-blowing, and also got me thinking about the use of procurement and eco labels as a form of regulation, which they are, right? So if you want to sell to the US government, you better have EPEAT certified or kind of EPEAT certified products. And that's a form, I thought, oh, that's a form of regulation. So I'm doing some work on the legitimacy from a theoretical standpoint, and also, you know, how that compares to conventional regulation. Is it a good idea to try to do that versus something else? Last thing, and I'll finish on this. I'm the chair of the A4 CTAC interest group on alternatives assessment. A4 is easier to say. And, you know, one of the things we're working on, 2 things there. One is this kind of semi-regular brown bag virtual luncheon. And everybody on the panel and the staff, talk to me if you'd like to come and have like a fun hour conversation, and you can even wear your pajamas. And that's kind of the model. And the other thing is A4 is doing 3 panels at CTAC in November in Portland. And you have till June 4th if you want to submit abstracts. So if you want to know about that, come and see me or Kelly or Molly, or where are you? Kelly, right. That's the Kelly I was talking about, Kelly. It's not all about you. Okay. Thank you.
That's amazing. And so just to add with Tim, the What's in Your Bag series, the idea with that name is that we liked the idea, you know, the brown bag thing, but the problem was we were doing morning in California, lunch in the East Coast, and dinner in the EU. And so the question is, what's in your bag, right? Like, yeah, anyway, that's where that came from. Right? A reusable bag. Exactly. Okay, so Heather, oh, excuse me, Anne.
Now I'm kind of stuck. Can I bring the cowbell plus the pajamas? I'm really confused. Thank you. This is a delight. I wish we had done this earlier in the process with the Urban Science Panel, and I hope you continue to do it. I'm going to break the no PhD string here, but I have fallen the category of a PhD that I have not used since I completed it. So my PhD is in molecular genetics and neural development, and Kelly actually asked me about my work a while ago, and I was like, yeah, it was a struggle to remember what the work was on, but now that I think about it, it was actually my earliest system. I decapitated a lot of fruit flies, and I looked at how we go from a bag of cells into a really defined system. So it's my first very small system, and that led me into systems work, I'm guessing. I also, I think what actually brought me to this work in retrospect was a very brief career as a science reporter on an NPR affiliate station. Where I interviewed the Northwest Coalition for Alternatives to Pesticides, and the big issue at the time in the early 90s was spraying 2,4-D on forests for control. And I was like, wait, what? And then started my career, as many of you know, here at DTSC as a RCRA inspector in Region 2 in surveillance and enforcement. And I usually describe this as looking at end of pipe and saying, there's got to be a better way to do this, which I think is going to be engraved on my gravestone. Like, you know, there must have been a better, there must be a better way. And then, like Kelly and a few others here, spent my career in science policy, the science policy interface, having gone through first regulatory enforcement, RCRA enforcement, creating better regulations, and then slowly moving up pipe to pollution prevention. When Kelly was on the Pollution Prevention Advisory Committee, I was on staff. And then 20 years as an independent consultant, basically poking at the system of chemicals production with a focus on disproportionately exposed populations, service workers, manufacturing workers. And at the end, I think having touched, a dozen consumer product sectors, trying to find safer alternatives. And in the process, learning about all the concerns and barriers and challenges that involves. And also working on international chemicals policy. I was, for a minute and a half, a global expert on PBDEs, because I'd read at that point all the 6 extant papers. Anybody know how many more papers there are on PBDEs these days? I think there are papers about how many papers there are. And that was an experience, international chemicals policy in Geneva. I used to say, you know, I do work with nail salon workers because I know I can have an immediate impact. I do state level work and local work, and then international work because you check in every decade or so to see where the progress is. I will say the exception has been the Global Plastics Treaty, which has gone super fast, and hopefully we'll get some good results there. What else to say? I guess where I am now, Tim said earlier that my career has taken some interesting turns. Where I sit now, I get to look at everything from place-based environmental justice work to global chemicals work. And what we're working on now, both on the movement side and philanthropy side, is we're talking to our climate friends who are focusing on emissions and industrial transition for major sectors. They've worked on cement and steel and aluminum, and now looking at petrochemicals. And so what we've been trying to drive is what I've called the decarb and detox agenda, because the focus has been on the emissions from the chemicals sector. And we're also talking about it being the industry of industries. It's the industry that underlies all of the things that we have talked about. So that's the current, my current focus, which is, you know, global and systemic. So it suits me beautifully. I did want to mention and echo some of the thanks to staff. One of the papers that Robin put up yesterday, it was a delight to work with you all on that. And Simona, I know Simona's not here, but we think about you, and it was Simona's leadership that got that paper published. It took us a while. And that paper was on the interconnection between chemical pollution and the climate crisis. And that's, I think, an important contribution that we have made. And we're spreading it around and hoping that particularly our friends in the EU and elsewhere, particularly in the Climate Foundation world, are looking at that work. And with that, I'll hand it off to Helen.
So one of these things is not like the other. I have a very different background than pretty much everybody here. So I am an engineer by training, and I started my career in manufacturing. So I was a process engineer doing soldering, and I'm deeply familiar with all of the materials that are found in electronics, especially solder, which happens to be one of my favorite materials. You can get me off topic by just asking me about solder. Solder, flux, printed circuit boards, flame retardants, adhesives, which may be relevant for you guys and some of the work you're going to be doing, displays, all the materials that are in displays. So Art and I share kind of an overlap on things, but I actually started in manufacturing. So manufacturing processes, manufacturing chemicals that are not actually, that don't become part of the process. I'm happy to help you in any of those kinds of topics. how I kind of got into this was actually in the Ross legislation days. So at that point, I was doing a lot of materials and qualifications and testing and so on and so on. And I asked the question, well, has anyone checked out the alternatives to make sure they're better than what we're getting rid of? And they had not. They had not. And I see Eva smiling because right? And that was genuinely a shock to me. And that's kind of how I ended up down this path, because it became a real focus to answer that question. If you're going to spend millions and millions of dollars and all this effort to get rid of something, you should make sure that it's better than what you're getting rid of. So anyway, and many of you know that I have been kind of at this for a bit, but I have part of why my perspective is very pragmatic is because I'm on the regulated side. I always try to be a voice of reason, of pragmatism, of making sure that whatever we put in place, that if you've got someone who's being regulated who in good faith is trying to comply, that they are able to do so. And so that comes from where my entry point into this. And back to the international regulation, it's like that was always the balanced approach of staying focused on what is the public health goal, making sure that what actions you're taking actually lead to the public health goal that you're trying to reach, and aligning in that way. Also, kind of that goes with this is familiar with supply chain, especially international supply chain, which may be helpful to you in some of the work you do. And plating, because I saw that in the list as well. So my master's work was on plating. So I'm happy to help with that if that comes up. So what I'm doing now, though, is I am the chief technologist for a battery material company. And so when I really started working on this very intensely, it is a chemically intensive product. There are many components to this. It's a very complicated product. We mentioned this yesterday a little bit, but I do think that there is some very important preventative work that should be happening as we're going through this electrification, as we're decarbonizing, so that we're not getting rid of carbon and creating a toxic legacy. And so the number one thing that I would actually suggest be somewhere in the thinking of what happens in what products and what chemicals you're looking at is that somehow battery, especially EV, these very large number of batteries that are going to be reaching end of life. We have not even begun to see this impact, because we just haven't had enough end-of-life vehicles that to start building that up. We think about like electronics waste. It took 20 or 30 years before we really started to have the impacts, and we'll see a similar sort of thing. It'll come sooner just because the volume of the material is a lot in a vehicle, but we really want to. I would encourage that we start working on that sooner rather than later. And just as sort of a not so much for this group, but I'm also the head of strategy of an AI hardware company. And that's relevant because we're making a very power efficient AI accelerator. And so if you're doing anything in the power reduction, if you're starting to be alarmed at what's going on in terms of the amount of power being used for AI, I'm also at your disposal to talk about that and help give you some perspective on what's going on and why and what we can do about it. And that's me.
Nice work, team. I'm hoping that this was helpful. I know this was super interesting for me. Many comments from many of you. I'm like, oh, I need to talk to you. Oh, I need to talk to you. So I hope that is also true for staff and also for each other, not just myself on this panel. And maybe we need to revisit this idea. So Alex and staff who proposed this, it was great to do. And so with that, I think we're just kind of moving to closing remarks for the panel. There'll probably be a debriefing survey from this experience. And with that, staff are continually interested in and topics for discussion and future meetings. So if there are, forgive the word, but it's what's coming to mind, any juicy topics that you think should be and could be useful discussion items, do share those out. I just want to return to honor where I started as we opened yesterday, and wanting to celebrate Anne. I'm not the only one that had some thoughts to share, and so several of our panelists have been, along with you, a very long tenure, and those individuals have been primed to share out some remarks of gratitude. And so with that, I'd like to turn the baton to Kelly.
I'm going to be very brief because I want to give Anne a few minutes to say something. And I just really want to thank Anne for her service to the state on this panel. And it was particularly important because Anne's the only person who's actually worked in this department who's on the panel. And she really stood out during the time when she was on staff, and I was chairing the Pollution Prevention Advisory Committee. And I remember when she went out into consulting, I was like, oh boy, that's pretty hard for a state staffer. And she's really just made such huge contributions professionally throughout her career. And the value of that, I just can't thank her enough for the value of the input she's given here. I still remember the early days when they were developing the regs and I'm drawing little flow charts and she's redrawing little flow charts and Tim's drawing little flow charts and Ken Geiser's drawing little flow charts and we're flow charting all together. But all the way through the whole full cycle of this process, I think Anne has really had an important impact on the department that maybe she doesn't fully appreciate or realize as happened today. So thank you, Anne.
Thanks, Kelly. And another person who's joined you on this journey since its inception is Art. I don't know if
doing what Kelly said. Gosh, we've been doing this for such a long time, and your contribution to the program has just been amazing. But on a more personal level, very early on, I had the pleasure or whatever of sitting next to Anne at one of the meetings, and I went off on one of my whatever, just making sarcastic comments about the program, and Anne would look at me and go, and every time I did it, she went. So I look really good on, if you were to look back on those things, and that particular time was because Anne was really managing my behavior.
Yeah, one of us may still have to do that going forward. I don't know. Okay, so Tim is another panelist here with a long tenure and long professional experience here with Anne.
Oh, thank you. Thanks for asking me to say a few words. I have 3 words. The first word is knowledgeable. I mean, from her discussion just about her work, she's always impressed me with how much she knows, not just about her area of expertise, but all these tangential related areas. So, but knowledge isn't enough. So the second word is insightful. So be able to take the knowledge and leverage it and use it to construct concepts and ideas and respond to questions. And she always does it in sort of this understated, calm, matter-of-fact way that, you know, is just, I really wish I could develop that quality. You've always been sort of a role model for me there. And then the last word is collaborative. So I've had the benefit of working not only on the panel with Anne, but working on a couple of projects and papers. And just an astounding collaborator. You can see it here. I've had the benefit of seeing it in person, and not only collaborative in kind of the substantive aspects of it, but collaborative at an interpersonal level. So it's like fun to work on a project and write a paper with Anne Blake. So, you know, those are my 3 words.
Thank you. Anne, if you want to, yeah, please.
Wow. I have notes because I had suspected I was going to get choked up. And I didn't want to forget anything. Thank you so much for your kind words. It has been an honor to serve. But I did want to take this moment to reflect because as with the folks that spoke, many of us have been involved in this long before this legislation was a twinkle in a legislator's eye. And so I think particularly in this moment of these very interesting times, it's good to reflect back on the power of a small group of people with an idea and what has come from that. So with different people picking up the idea as it went along. So almost 2 decades ago, we were sitting in a colleague's living room, a dozen of us sort of fleshing this out. And that became the basis of the Green Chemistry Initiative, which in turn, a little like Robin's, the numbers kept decreasing. We had 6 planks in the Green Chemistry Initiative. This was one of them. There were committees before this one, large and rowdy ones, if I remember correctly, sitting in the audience. They were somewhat unmanageable, but they did contribute to this work. And it's just been phenomenal to be, and then the legislation, the report that our own Tim Malloy contributed to, along with the UC Berkeley colleagues, Meg Schwartzman, who used to be on this committee, and Mike Wilson, a longtime collaborator. And then to take that and to sit here 2 decades later to see what this program is doing, to hear something like Pearl, which was, and to talk about the data tools that you have and the processes, and to talk about refining an established process and still remembering back to writing and rewriting the regulations. To have seen it through the entire process is really gratifying. And with an extra layer of pride, because this is in the agency where I started my career longer ago than I will care to admit. So yes, thank you for all of that. What to say? Yes, so holding an idea, that's a precious thing. Don't be afraid to take an idea forward. And I know from seeing the staff here that you are not afraid of that. I am deeply, deeply grateful for the camaraderie of the people on this panel, both here and past. Collaborations like the one with Tim and UCLA and many others would not have happened without the context of here. I've learned so much from each of you, particularly from Helen, and many others about the worlds that you inhabit. And every conversation here and outside this room has been eye-opening. And so I deeply, deeply appreciate your wisdom, your humor, your persistence, and I won't make any bad jokes about bioaccumulation as well. The humor can sometimes be of the cowbell variety. So yes, thank you for that. And I do want to remember a few colleagues who are no longer with us. Julia Quint, particularly, Ken Zarker, and Melanie Marty. Know that your legacy is that you were missed and your legacy lives on. SCP staff, can't say enough about you, just echoing what everybody has said. You are amazing. It is phenomenal to watch you do the work that you do, and to take what you have in your hands now and turn it into something really remarkable. It is, do not underestimate how the world is paying attention to what you're doing. Of course, a lot of us talk it up as well when we travel, but in addition to that, Suzanne's comment about her EU colleague adding the citation, that's real impact. So it has been an honor to serve this state and its rich diversity for my chosen home for the last 30 plus years. And I know this program will continue to be a beacon for science-based decision-making that also takes into account current and historic inequities and is not afraid of taking bold action to address those inequities. So I thank you for that, and I know that you're going to hold that close. Thank you for an amazing, I won't say how long, at least a couple of decades, and service on this panel, and I know I leave this work in good hands. I'm not going far, you know how to reach me, and I'm happy to provide support as you move things forward. I just won't be coming to Sacramento twice a year, so thanks so much.
Okay, I might not be getting teary-eyed, but I am. So with that, I'm going to have to pass it off to Robin if she has any last words, or Mike to help close us out.
Oh, that's impossible to follow. That is really, really hard. And I just want to express my gratitude for your years of service. And I'm very grateful that I'm able to meet you here in person at least once. And I just really value all of your contributions here. And that goes for many of you on the panel. Thank you, Mike and Molly, for leading us through this 2-day marathon of information. I said it yesterday, you guys navigated a conversation that was complex and wide-ranging, and you did it elegantly, and you did it again today. And I really appreciate your leadership on this panel. I also just want to say thank you to this group for the very, very lovely conversation that I had last night at dinner that had nothing to do with any of the topics here. We were actually talking about hope, and we were talking about hope in the context of the future and some of the books that we were reading. And I want to say that I do have a lot of hope for our future when I think about all of the work, all of the fantastic information that's come out of this team, all of the promises that we have to reach back out to each one of you after learning more about your backgrounds so that we can work together towards a more hopeful future. And I want to say thank you to my team who's been helping to support us through all of this. And I'm looking over at the folks who are in the room. So I cannot say how much gratitude I have for the team that's put this event on. It's huge. Alex, Kyle, Anna, Catlin, and Justin, thank you for keeping us functional and running and keeping all of us on track, on target. Paul, thank you so much for keeping us literally connected. Anella, Heather, Carly, Valerie, and Bauku have been working behind the scenes to keep us hydrated, well fed, and organized, but it's all sorts of logistics. And there's also a team of staff who are here, not just listening and learning, but also taking notes vigorously, and they will be digesting them and repackaging them so that we have something to reflect upon again in about a year to maybe 5 years when I bring back the information and tell you exactly what we've done with all of the terrific input that you've shared with us the past couple of days. So thank you. And with that, I think we're free to go.
Absolutely, that will wrap it up. I think they have said everything I wanted to say in a much more eloquent way. But I want to add, thank you for the morning of Robin. You did a very good job with that. You didn't recognize yourself, but a big part of it was what you contributed as well. So this, again, thank you to the staff for putting together an excellent agenda for us, putting time in together. Thanks to the panel for engaging in it's amazing how everyone on the panel manages to engage with everything the staff's interested in. Excellent job around the board. So thank you all, and we are adjourned.